The wagon lurched to a stop, and Eliza Ward knew immediately that something was wrong. She'd spent 3 weeks crossing half a continent in cramped stagecoaches, dusty rail cars, and finally, this bone-rattling supply wagon. 3 weeks of bad food, worse company, and a single-minded determination to reach the Mercer Ranch, a place the advertisement had called a respectable household seeking domestic help for a growing enterprise. The words had seemed almost gentle on the page, written in careful script on a notice board in St. Louis. She'd memorized every line, but the man waiting at the gate didn't look gentle. He was broad-shouldered and sun-scorched, with a face that seemed carved from the same hard stone as the mountains behind him. His hat sat low, casting shadows across features that hadn't smiled in what looked like years. When the wagon driver called out a greeting, the man didn't return it. He just stared at Eliza with the kind of cold assessment usually reserved for livestock. "This her?" His voice matched his face. Flat, worn, suspicious. The driver, an older man who'd been kind enough during the journey, shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, sir, Mr. Garrett. Miss Ward, as requested." Garrett. Eliza made note of the name. She'd expected to meet Mr. Mercer, the ranch owner who'd supposedly approved her hire through a placement agency. Instead, she got this man, whose eyes traveled over her with obvious disapproval. She'd dressed carefully that morning in her best traveling dress, dark blue wool, modest and practical. Her hair was pinned neatly despite the journey. She'd wanted to make a good impression, but looking at Garrett's expression, she might as well have arrived in rags. "Get down," he said. It wasn't an invitation. Eliza gathered her skirts and climbed down from the wagon, trying to ignore the way her legs trembled from exhaustion and nerves. Her 2 bags, everything she owned, landed in the dust beside her with heavy thumps. "Thank you," she said to the driver, managing a smile. He tipped his hat, looking almost apologetic, then clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon rolled away, and Eliza felt her last connection to civilization disappear with it. She turned to face Garrett, straightening her spine. "I'm Eliza Ward. I believe Mr. Mercer is expecting me." "Mercer's in town. Won't be back till tomorrow." Garrett circled her slowly, like a buyer examining a horse. "You're smaller than I expected. I assure you I'm quite capable." "Capable of what, exactly?" He stopped in front of her, arms crossed. "You know what kind of work we do here?" The advertisement specified domestic duties: cooking, cleaning, household management. Did it specify that we're 20 miles from the nearest town? That we work cattle, horses, and hay from sunup to sundown? That every person on this ranch earns their keep or they don't eat? Eliza's jaw tightened. "I'm prepared to work, Mr. Garrett." "Are you now?" It wasn't a question. He glanced past her toward the main house, a sprawling structure of rough-hewn logs and stone that looked more fortress than home. "See, here's the problem, Miss Ward. We requested help 3 months ago. 3 months. In that time, we've been managing without. The boys have been rotating kitchen duty, washing their own clothes, keeping their own bunks. It's not ideal, but it works." "Then why?" "Because Mercer's got ideas about running a civilized operation." Garrett's tone made civilized sound like a disease. "He thinks having a woman around will improve morale, bring some refinement to the place. Me? I think it's a waste of wages we can't afford." The words landed like stones. Eliza had heard variations of this her entire life, that she was unnecessary, decorative, more trouble than she was worth. She'd left St. Louis partly to escape that exact sentiment from an uncle who'd made it clear she was a burden on his household. "I see," she said quietly, "and yet here I am." "Here you are." Garrett picked up one of her bags, testing its weight. "What's in here, books?" "Personal items." "Books," he confirmed, dropping it back down. "Of course. Well, Miss Ward, let me be clear. I don't care what Mercer promised you in some letter. This isn't St. Louis or Boston or wherever you're from. This is hard country, and it doesn't care about your education or your manners or whatever skills you think you have. Out here you pull your weight or you sink." "I understand. Do you?" He stepped closer, and Eliza forced herself not to retreat. "Because I've seen your type before. City women who come west thinking it'll be an adventure. They last maybe a month before they're crying to go home. And in that month, they cause nothing but disruption." "I have no home to return to," Eliza said, and hated how her voice wavered on the last word. Something flickered in Garrett's expression. Not quite sympathy, but maybe recognition. He studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Fine. You want to stay, you'll work, but not in the house. I was hired for domestic what? I don't care what you were hired for. I need hands in the fields. We're bringing in the last hay cutting before the weather turns, and we're short 3 men who quit last month. You'll help with that. Eliza stared at him. Mr. Garrett, I have no experience with— Then you'll learn, unless you'd prefer to get back on that wagon? He gestured toward the road, though the wagon was long gone. Oh, wait. It already left. Guess you're stuck here until the supply run next week. So you can either make yourself useful, or you can sit in the bunkhouse and explain to Mercer when he gets back why you refuse to work. The choice wasn't a choice at all, and they both knew it. Eliza had spent the last of her money on the journey west. The placement agency had taken a fee up front. She had perhaps $3 to her name, and no way to leave even if she wanted to. When do I start? She asked. Now. Garrett turned toward the fields, already walking away. Leave your bags. Someone will move them later. But now, Miss Ward. She followed because there was nothing else to do. The hayfield stretched out like an ocean of gold under the afternoon sun. Eliza had never seen so much empty space in her life. No buildings to break up the horizon, no trees except for a thin line marking a creek in the distance, just grass and sky and mountains that looked both beautiful and hostile in their indifference. There were 7 men working the field, moving in practiced rhythm with scythes and pitchforks. They looked up when Garrett approached, and Eliza felt their stares like physical weight. This is Miss Ward, Garrett announced. She'll be helping with the cutting. A few of the men exchanged glances. One of them, younger than the others with sunburned features and straw-colored hair, actually laughed. Her? Garrett, she'll last about 10 minutes before she passes out. Then we get 10 minutes of work out of her, Miller. Garrett grabbed a pitchfork from a nearby cart and thrust it at Eliza. You know how to use one of these? I've never— Stick the fork in the hay, lift it onto the wagon, repeat until the field is clear or you collapse. Whichever comes first. The wooden handle was rough against her palms. The fork itself was heavier than she'd expected, the metal tines sharp and unforgiving. Eliza looked at the endless rows of cut hay waiting to be loaded, then at the men watching her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright hostility. She'd known this journey would be difficult. She'd prepared herself for hard work, long hours, isolation. But she hadn't prepared for this, for being thrown into labor she had no training for, surrounded by men who'd already decided she would fail. Problem, Miss Ward? Garrett's voice held a challenge. Eliza tightened her grip on the pitchfork. No problem. Good. Then get to work. Shut. The first hour was the hardest. Her hands blistered almost immediately, the rough wood tearing through skin that had only ever known needlework and pen. Each lift of the pitchfork sent jolts of pain through her shoulders and back, muscles she didn't know she had, suddenly screaming in protest. The hay was heavier than it looked, awkward and unwieldy, and half the time it slid off the fork before she could get it onto the wagon. The men worked around her with practiced efficiency, their movements smooth and economical. They didn't speak to her, barely acknowledged her presence, except to occasionally shift their positions so she wouldn't impale them with her clumsy attempts. Sweat soaked through her dress. Dust and chaff stuck to her skin, working into every fold of fabric. Her carefully pinned hair began to fall loose, strands sticking to her neck and face. She'd removed her jacket within the first 20 minutes, but it hadn't helped. The sun beat down relentlessly, and there was no shade anywhere in the field. You need a break, miss? The voice came from her left. The young one called Miller. He didn't sound kind exactly, more like he was offering her an easy out, a chance to prove she didn't belong. I'm fine, Eliza managed, driving her fork into another pile of hay. Suit yourself? The second hour was worse than the first. Her blisters burst, leaving raw patches that burned with every movement. Her back began to spasm, muscles cramping from the repetitive motion. She'd long since stopped trying to match the men's pace and focused only on not stopping. Each lift was agony. Each step toward the wagon felt like moving through deep water. But she didn't stop. She thought about her mother, dead these 6 years. About her father, gone before she could remember him. About the uncle who'd told her she was a waste of space, eating food meant for his sons, taking up room in a household that had no use for an unmarried woman with no prospects and no dowry. She thought about the women in St. Louis who'd looked at her with pity, who'd suggested she find a husband, any husband, before she became too old to be wanted. She thought about every person who'd ever told her she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, valuable enough. And she drove the pitchfork into the hay again. Garrett called a halt when the sun touched the mountains. "That's enough for today," he announced. "Load's full. We'll finish the rest tomorrow." The men dropped their tools immediately, heading toward the water barrel near the wagon with obvious relief. Eliza tried to do the same, but her hands wouldn't release the pitchfork handle. Her fingers had locked around the wood, cramped and unresponsive. She stood there, swaying slightly, trying to force her hands open. Jesus! Miller appeared beside her, prying her fingers loose with surprising gentleness. "You're bleeding." She looked down at her palms, raw, torn, covered in a mix of blood and dirt. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're a mess." He took the pitchfork from her, shaking his head. "Garrett shouldn't have put you out here. This is insane." "I can handle it." "Yeah, I can see that. Real inspiring." But there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite respect, but maybe the beginning of it. "Come on, let's get you to the water." Her legs trembled as she walked, every muscle threatening to give out. She made it to the barrel and took the dipper Miller offered, drinking deeply. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the best thing she'd ever had. "You actually did it," Miller said, watching her. "I figured you'd quit after the first hour." "I don't quit." So I noticed. He glanced back at the field, at the small but visible dent they'd made in the hay. "Look, I don't know what Garrett's trying to prove, but Miller!" Garrett's voice cut across the field. "Stop socializing and get that wagon hitched. We need it unloaded before dark." Miller gave Eliza an apologetic look and headed off. She stood by the water barrel trying to gather enough strength to move when she noticed one of the other men approaching. He was older than Miller, maybe 40, with a weathered face and calculating eyes. He stopped a few feet away, looking her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "You got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "Stupid, but guts." Eliza straightened, ignoring the way her back screamed in protest. "Thank you, I think. Name's Coleman. I run the bunkhouse, manage supplies." He moved closer, and she caught the smell of old sweat and tobacco. "You need anything? Medicine for those hands? Extra blanket? Better food than what Garrett serves? You come find me. I can arrange things." "That's kind of you." "I'm not kind, Miss Ward. Nothing on this ranch is free, but I'm willing to make accommodations for the right person." His eyes traveled down her body in a way that made his meaning clear. Eliza's stomach turned. "I see. Well, I won't be needing any special accommodations, Mr. Coleman. I'll manage on my own." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Will you now? That's real brave. But you're in a tough spot, seems to me. No money, no way out, and Garrett's not going to make things easier. Might be you change your mind once you realize how hard this life is." "I won't." "We'll see." He tipped his hat, that cold smile still in place. "Offer stands if you get desperate. And Miss Ward, everyone gets desperate eventually." He walked away and Eliza had to lock her knees to keep from shaking. She'd encountered men like Coleman before, men who saw vulnerability as opportunity, who offered help with strings attached. She'd always managed to avoid them in St. Louis, protected by the thin veneer of her uncle's household. Out here, she had no such protection. "Miss Ward," Garrett's voice made her jump. He was standing by the wagon, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You'll bunk in the house tonight. Third room on the left, upstairs. There's a basin for washing. Dinner's at sundown in the main hall. Don't be late." It was the first remotely civil thing he'd said to her. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. "And Ward?" He waited until she met his eyes. "You did better than I expected today. Worse than we needed, but better than I expected." It wasn't praise exactly, but it wasn't condemnation either. She'd take it. Mati. The room was small and sparse, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, but it was clean, and more importantly, it was private. Eliza closed the door behind her and finally let herself collapse. Her entire body was one vast ache. Her hands throbbed. Her shoulders felt like someone had beaten them with clubs. When she tried to remove her dress, she found she couldn't raise her arms high enough. She had to work the buttons from the bottom up, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her torn palms. The dress was ruined, stained with sweat and dirt, torn in places from the rough work. Her chemise underneath was in better shape, but not by much. She stripped down to her undergarments and approached the basin, which someone had filled with cool water. The first touch of wet cloth against her hands made her gasp, but she cleaned them methodically, picking out bits of wood and debris, watching the water turn pink with blood. There was no mirror in the room, which was probably for the best. She didn't want to see what she looked like. A knock on the door made her freeze. "Miss Ward?" A woman's voice, older, with a hint of an accent Eliza couldn't place. "I've brought some salve for your hands. May I come in?" Eliza grabbed her ruined dress, holding it in front of her. "Yes, please." The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, sturdy and practical-looking, with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes. She carried a small basket and took in Eliza's state with a single glance. "Lord have mercy," she said. "What was Garrett thinking?" "He was thinking I needed to earn my keep. By breaking you in half?" The woman set the basket down and pulled out a tin of something that smelled strongly of herbs. "I'm Mary Chen. I cook for the house and the foreman's quarters. Been here 15 years, which makes me the closest thing to civilization this place has." "Eliza Ward?" "I know who you are. Whole ranch knows by now." Mary took Eliza's hands gently, examining the damage. "This is going to hurt." It did. The salve burned like fire against the raw flesh, and Eliza had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. But Mary's hands were gentle and efficient, wrapping clean cloth around each palm once the salve was applied. "You'll want to keep these wrapped for a few days," Mary said. "And don't let Garrett put you back in that field. Those hands need time to heal or they'll get infected, and then you'll be no good to anyone." "I can work, but it's out." "Not like this, you can't." Mary fixed her with a stern look. "You proved whatever point you needed to prove. Now show some sense and let yourself recover." Eliza wanted to argue, but the relief of having someone on her side, even a stranger, was overwhelming. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Just Mary. And you're welcome, though I wish I could do more." She began repacking her basket. "Fair warning. Most of the men here are decent enough, but some aren't. Coleman especially. You stay away from him, you hear? He already approached me." Mary's expression darkened. "Of course he did. Vulture probably saw you as easy prey. You turn him down?" "I did." "Good. He'll try again, though. Men like that always do." She moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. Mr. Mercer gets back tomorrow. When he does, you tell him what happened today. All of it. Garrett overstepped his authority, and Mercer needs to know. I don't want to cause trouble. You didn't cause it. Garrett did. And if Mercer's half the man I think he is, there'll be consequences." Mary opened the door. "Dinner's in 20 minutes. Come down if you can manage it, even if it's just to eat. You need your strength." She left, and Eliza was alone again with her pain and her racing thoughts. She'd survived her first day. Barely. But she'd survived. The question now was whether she could survive the rest. Dinner was served in a long hall attached to the main house. When Eliza entered, conversation died. There were maybe 15 men gathered around a rough wooden table, most of them covered in the same dust and sweat as her. They turned to stare as she made her way to an empty seat at the far end, moving like an old woman despite being only 23. Mary appeared from the kitchen with platters of food, beef stew, bread, potatoes. Simple fare, but it smelled like heaven. Eliza's stomach growled embarrassingly loud. "Eat," Mary said, setting a bowl in front of her. "Don't wait for permission." The men began serving themselves, and gradually the conversation resumed. Talk of tomorrow's work, complaints about equipment, speculation about the weather. Eliza ate mechanically, trying not to draw attention to herself, but she could feel eyes on her throughout the meal. Garrett sat at the head of the table, saying little. Coleman was there too, watching her with that same calculating expression. Miller gave her a brief nod when their eyes met, which felt like a victory. She was halfway through her stew when a new voice cut through the chatter. "Well, I see we have a guest." The speaker was young, maybe 30 at most, with dark hair, sharp features, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He'd entered from a side door, still wearing riding clothes, dirt on his boots. Unlike the others, He didn't look at Eliza with suspicion or hostility. He looked intrigued. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett said, standing abruptly, "we didn't expect you back until tomorrow. Finish the business early." Mercer moved to the table, his gaze fixed on Eliza. "And you must be Miss Ward. The letter said you'd arrive today. I'd hoped to be here to greet you properly, but it seems you've already settled in." His tone was pleasant, almost apologetic. Eliza struggled to stand, her body protesting every movement. "Please, don't get up," Mercer said quickly. "You look exhausted. Garrett, what have you had her doing?" "Field work," Garrett said flatly. "We needed hands for the hay cutting." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. "Field work. I see. And Miss Ward, how did you find your first day at the ranch?" Every eye was on her. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was where she either backed down or stood her ground, where she either accepted what had been done to her or challenged it. She thought about her mother, who'd always told her to be gracious, to avoid confrontation. Then she thought about her torn hands, her aching body, Coleman's leering offer. "I found it educational, Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "though I confess I was surprised by the work assignment. The advertisement specified domestic duties." "It did," Mercer agreed, "because that's what I requested when I contacted the placement agency. Domestic duties, household management, and general administration. I was quite specific about that." He turned to Garrett, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Garrett, might I have a word with you? Privately?" It wasn't a question. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course." The two men left through the side door. The moment they disappeared, the hall erupted in whispered conversation. Eliza focused on her food, trying to ignore the stares and speculation swirling around her. Miller leaned across the table. "For what it's worth, I think Garrett's going to catch hell for this." "I didn't mean to cause problems," Eliza said quietly. "You didn't. He did. Mercer's not like most ranchers. He actually cares about doing things right. And putting you in the field like that?" Miller shook his head. "That wasn't right, no matter how you look at it." Coleman laughed from down the table. "Oh, I don't know. I think it was a fine introduction to how things work around here. Miss Ward learned real quick that this isn't some gentleman's estate. This is a working ranch, and everyone pulls weight." "She pulled her weight," Miller shot back. "Did better than some men I've seen." "For one day. Let's see how she does after a week." "She won't be in the fields for a week," Mary said firmly, emerging from the kitchen. "Not with those hands. She needs time to heal before she does any real work." "Convenient," Coleman muttered. Eliza set down her spoon, her appetite gone. The conversation swirled around her, some defending her, others questioning her, all of them treating her like an object to be debated rather than a person sitting right there. She was about to excuse herself when the side door opened and Mercer returned. "Alone. Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "I'd like to make something clear. Miss Ward was hired for specific duties, which I outlined months ago. Those duties do not include field labor unless she chooses to take it on voluntarily. From this point forward, she'll be working in the house and assisting with the ranch accounts, as originally planned." He paused, looking at each man in turn. "Furthermore, I expect everyone on this ranch to treat her with the same respect they'd show any other worker here. She's not a guest, she's not a burden, and she's certainly not someone to be tested or hazed. She's an employee of this ranch, same as all of you. Is that understood?" Silence. Then, slowly, nods around the table. "Good. Now finish your dinner." Mercer turned to Eliza. "Miss Ward, when you're done eating, I'd like to show you the office where you'll be working, if you're not too tired." "I'm fine," Eliza lied. "Excellent." He smiled, and for the first time since arriving, she felt like maybe, just maybe, this might work out after all. She didn't see Garrett anywhere, and she didn't see the way Coleman's eyes followed her as she left the hall, his expression dark with something that looked like hatred. The office was smaller than Eliza expected, tucked into a corner of the main house with a single window overlooking the eastern pastures. A desk dominated the space, buried under stacks of ledgers, loose papers, and what looked like several months of unopened correspondence. Dust particles hung in the lamplight, and the air smelled of old ink and neglect. Mercer stood in the doorway, looking almost embarrassed. "It's not much, I'm afraid. My father kept meticulous records, but since he passed 2 years ago, I've been managing the ranch and trying to handle the books. And I'm not particularly good at both." Eliza stepped inside, her wrapped hands brushing against the edge of the desk. Even through the bandages, she could feel the rough wood grain. "You've been running this alone?" "More or less. Garrett handles the day-to-day operations. The men, the livestock, the land management. He's good at that. Better than me, honestly." Mercer moved to the desk, shuffling papers without really looking at them. "But the business side, accounts, payroll, supplies, contracts with buyers, that's fallen through the cracks. I keep telling myself I'll get to it, and then something else demands attention." He picked up a ledger, flipped it open to a page of cramped handwriting, and crossed out numbers. "This is from June. It's October now. I'm 4 months behind on reconciling the books, and I have no idea if we're actually making money or just bleeding it." Eliza took the ledger from him carefully, scanning the entries. The handwriting was terrible, the columns uneven, and several calculations had been done incorrectly. She could see that much even in the dim light. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the desk chair. "Please." She sat, ignoring the way her body screamed in protest, and pulled the lamp closer. For the next several minutes, she worked through the June entries, making mental notes of discrepancies and errors. Mercer watched in silence. "Your cattle sale on June 14th, she said finally. "You recorded receiving $800, but the math here shows you should have gotten $900 based on the head count and agreed price per animal." Mercer leaned over her shoulder, frowning. "Are you sure?" 60 head at $15 each is $900, but you only recorded $800 in revenue." She looked up at him. "Either the buyer shorted you $100, or someone recorded the wrong amount. Or someone pocketed the difference." The words hung in the air between them. Eliza set down the ledger carefully. "I'm not suggesting—" "No, you're right to point it out. I should have caught that months ago." Mercer dragged a hand through his hair, suddenly looking exhausted. "This is exactly why I needed help. I can't manage the land and keep track of these details. And clearly, I can't trust that everything's being reported accurately." He pulled up the other chair and sat across from her. "Miss Ward, I'll be honest with you. This ranch is in trouble. We're not broke yet, but we're heading that direction. Costs are rising, we've lost good men to better opportunities, and I'm making decisions based on incomplete information. I need someone who can organize this mess and tell me the truth about where we stand financially." "And you think I can do that?" "Mary told me you worked for a law firm in St. Louis, that you managed their accounts and correspondence for 3 years before the senior partner died and his son took over." Eliza's chest tightened. "Mary talks a lot." "Mary pays attention. It's why I trust her." Mercer's expression was serious. "Look, I know today was terrible. Garrett was out of line, and I've made that clear to him. But I also know you stayed in that field for 6 hours, despite having no idea what you were doing. That tells me you don't quit when things get hard." "I didn't have much choice." "You had choices. You could have walked off, sat down, demanded better treatment. You didn't. You just kept working." He gestured to the chaos around them. "This office needs someone with that kind of determination, someone who'll wade through this disaster and not give up halfway through." Eliza looked at the stacks of papers, the disordered ledgers, the accumulation of months of neglect. Part of her wanted to run from it, but another part, the part that had always found satisfaction in bringing order to chaos and solving problems that others ignored, felt a familiar pull. "I'd need access to everything," she said. "All financial records, supply invoices, payroll information, contracts, no restrictions. Done. And I'd need authority to ask questions. Of you, of Garrett, of anyone involved in ranch operations." Mercer hesitated for just a moment. "That might cause friction." "It will definitely cause friction. But if you want accurate information, I need to be able to verify what I'm seeing in these books against what's actually happening." "Fair enough." He extended his hand. "You have my authorization to access any records and ask any questions necessary. If someone gives you trouble, send them to me." Eliza shook his hand, trying not to wince as the motion pulled at her bandaged palms. His grip was firm but careful, and she noticed he was mindful of her injuries. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're able." "But Miss Ward—" "Eliza, if I may." He waited for her nod. "Take care of your hands first. This work isn't going anywhere, and I need you functional for the long term, not broken down in a week." It was the first time anyone had called her by her first name since she'd arrived. The informality felt strange, but not unwelcome. "I'll be ready tomorrow," she promised. The walk back to her room felt longer than it should have. Every step reminded her of the day's abuse, and by the time she closed the door behind her, she was shaking with exhaustion. She collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, too tired to even remove her boots. Sleep came fast and heavy, pulling her under before she could think too much about what she'd agreed to. She woke before dawn to the sound of men moving below, boots on wooden floors, low voices preparing for another day. Her body felt like it had been trampled by horses. Moving was agony. Breathing hurt. But she got up anyway. Mary had left fresh bandages and more salve outside her door, along with a simple cotton dress that looked more practical than anything Eliza owned. She managed to change clothes and rewrap her hands, working slowly and carefully. The face that looked back at her from the small hand mirror was sunburned and drawn, with dark circles under the eyes and hair that had given up any pretense of style. She looked like hell. She felt worse, but she made it downstairs as the sun crept over the mountains. The office looked even worse in daylight. What had seemed like disorganization in lamplight revealed itself as near chaos. Papers had been stuffed into drawers randomly, ledgers were stacked without any clear system, and some documents had water damage that made them barely readable. Eliza stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and felt a familiar sensation settle over her, the calm that came before tackling an impossible task. She'd felt it before, walking into the law firm's records room after old Mr. Patterson had died, and discovering 3 years of backlogged filing. Everyone else had looked at that mess and despaired. She'd looked at it and seen a puzzle waiting to be solved. This was no different. She started with the basics, clearing the desk, sorting papers by type and date, creating stacks that made sense. Financial records here, correspondence there, supply invoices in a third pile. Within an hour, she'd created a system. Within 2, she'd found the oldest ledger and started working forward chronologically. The numbers told a story, and it wasn't a good one. The Mercer Ranch had been profitable once. 2 years ago, the ledgers showed healthy margins, consistent sales, and careful expense management. But after the elder Mercer's death, things had started to slip. Small expenses that added up, payments that went out but weren't properly recorded, revenue that seemed inconsistent with the livestock counts. She was cross-referencing a supply invoice against a payment ledger when someone knocked. "Come in," she called, not looking up. "So it's true. You're actually working." She recognized Coleman's voice before she saw him. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with that same calculating expression from last night. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Coleman?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. "Just curious what you're doing in here. Garrett said Mercer put you on the books." "That's correct." "Interesting choice. Most women would have taken house duties, easier work, less responsibility." He moved into the office uninvited, picking up a ledger from one of her sorted stacks. "But I suppose you're not most women, are you?" Eliza stood, positioning herself between Coleman and the desk. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't disturb my organization system. I'm trying to create order here." "Order?" Coleman flipped through the ledger idly. "You know what I think? I think Mercer's making a mistake. See, these books, they're complicated. Lots of moving parts, lots of places where numbers might not add up perfectly. Easy to get confused if you don't understand how a ranch operates. I'm quite good with numbers, Mr. Coleman." "I'm sure you are, but numbers on paper aren't the same as understanding the reality of operations. Sometimes there are reasons things don't match up exactly. Legitimate reasons." His eyes met hers. "Would be a shame if you jumped to the wrong conclusions and caused problems for people just trying to do their jobs." The threat was barely veiled. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "If there are legitimate reasons for discrepancies, I'm sure whoever's responsible can explain them clearly. Transparency helps everyone." "Does it now?" Coleman set the ledger down, but not where she'd had it. "You know what else helps everyone? Cooperation, teamwork. Understanding that we all have to work together out here, and stirring up trouble benefits no one. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to do my job." "Right. Your job." He moved closer, and Eliza fought the urge to step back. "Here's some free advice, Miss Ward. This ranch has a way of doing things, rhythms and relationships that took years to establish. You're new. You don't understand how everything fits together yet. So maybe take your time before making waves." "Thank you for the advice," Eliza said coldly. "Was there anything else?" Coleman studied her for a long moment, then smiled that humorless smile. "No, that's all. For now." He left, and Eliza released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands were shaking, from fear or anger, she couldn't tell. Maybe both. She looked down at the ledger he'd handled, noting which one it was. June through August, the same period where she'd already spotted discrepancies. Interesting. She dove back into the work with renewed focus. If Coleman was worried about what she might find, that meant there was definitely something to find. She just had to figure out what it was without getting herself run off the ranch, or worse, in the process. By midday, she'd worked through 3 months of records and created a preliminary list of issues that needed investigation. Missing receipts, payments that didn't match invoices, livestock sales that seemed underreported. Nothing definitive yet, but patterns were emerging. A knock interrupted her, gentler this time. "Miss Ward?" Miller's voice. "Mary sent me to make sure you eat something. Says you've been in here since dawn." Eliza glanced up, surprised to find the sun high in the sky. "What time is it?" "Past noon. Come on, there's lunch in the hall." "I should keep working. Mary said you'd say that. She also said she'll come drag you out herself if I come back without you." Miller grinned. "And between you and me, Mary's a lot scarier than she looks." Despite everything, Eliza smiled. "Fine. Give me a moment to make notes on where I left off." The hall was quieter at lunch, with only about half the men present. The others were presumably out working. Eliza took a seat near Mary, who immediately loaded a plate with beef, bread, and vegetables. "Eat," Mary commanded. "All of it. You're already too thin and you can't work if you faint." "Yes, ma'am." Miller sat across from them, along with 2 other men Eliza didn't know. One was older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and gentle eyes. The other was younger, dark-skinned, with muscular arms and a quiet demeanor. "Miss Ward, this is Tom Richards," Miller said, gesturing to the older man. "He manages the horse operation. And this is Samuel, we just call him Sam. He handles equipment repair and maintenance." "Pleasure to meet you both," Eliza said. Tom nodded. "Heard you did well in the field yesterday. That was rough what Garrett did to you." "I survived." "More than survived," Sam said quietly. "Talk as you kept pace for 6 hours with torn hands. Most men would have quit." "Most men wouldn't have been put in that position," Mary interjected. "Most men would have been treated with basic decency." An uncomfortable silence fell. Miller cleared his throat. "So, how's the office work going? Making sense of Mercer's mess?" "Slowly," Eliza said, "but I'm making progress." "Find anything interesting?" Tom asked, then caught himself. "Sorry, not my business." "It's fine, though I probably shouldn't discuss specific findings until I've verified them and reported to Mr. Mercer." "Smart," Tom agreed. "Loose talk causes problems." They ate in companionable silence for a while. Eliza found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the lack of hostility. These men weren't treating her like a threat or an oddity. They were just normal, polite, professional. "Where's Garrett today?" Miller asked Mary. "Out with the cattle crew. Won't be back till tonight." Mary gave Eliza a meaningful look. "Mercer had words with him yesterday, strong words. Don't know exactly what was said, but Garrett's been keeping his distance from the house." "Good," Sam muttered. "Now, we don't need to pile on," Tom said. "Garrett's got his faults, but he's been running operations here for years. He keeps things moving." "Doesn't give him the right to treat people like dirt," Miller countered. "Didn't say it did. Just saying it's complicated." Eliza listened to the exchange with interest. There was clearly tension around Garrett's role, but also recognition of his competence. The ranch needed him, even if he made enemies doing his job. She was contemplating this when Mercer entered the hall from the outside, dusty and tired-looking. "Eliza," he said, spotting her. "Good, you're eating. When you're finished, could you come to the office? I'd like to hear what you've found so far." "Of course." He grabbed bread and cheese, eating quickly while standing, then disappeared back outside. The men exchanged glances. "He's pushing himself too hard," Mary said, frowning. "That boy never stops." "He's trying to prove he can fill his father's boots," Tom said. "Can't fault him for that." "Can fault him for running himself into the ground," Mary retorted. "His father knew how to delegate. Caleb thinks he has to do everything himself." Eliza filed that observation away. Mercer, Caleb, was carrying too much weight, which explained why the books had fallen into such disarray. No one person could manage a ranch this size alone. She finished her meal and returned to the office, where Caleb was already waiting, looking over her organized stacks. "This is remarkable," he said. "You've done more in one morning than I managed in a month. Organization is easier than reconciliation. I've only scratched the surface of the actual problems." "What have you found?" Eliza pulled out her notes. "Several things concern me. First, your supply expenses are running about 15% higher than they should be based on standard pricing for this region. Either you're being overcharged, or the quantities being ordered don't match what's being recorded." Caleb's expression darkened. "Go on." "Second, there are discrepancies in livestock sale revenue. Several instances where the recorded income doesn't match the expected amount based on headcount and market prices. Third, payroll seems inconsistent. Some months you're paying for more men than appear on the active roster." "How much are we talking about?" "Conservatively, I'd estimate you've lost somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 over the past year to unexplained discrepancies." Caleb sat down heavily. $3,000, that's significant. It could be honest mistakes. Poor record keeping, mathematical errors, miscommunication with buyers. She paused. Or it could be deliberate. Theft. Possibly. I'd need to investigate further to be certain. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers on the desk. "My father always said that running a ranch meant trusting people. He trusted Garrett completely, let him handle most of the business transactions. When I took over, I just continued that arrangement because I didn't know any better. Garrett handles the transactions. He or Coleman, they work together on most of the buying and selling. Garrett negotiates, Coleman manages the logistics and paperwork." Eliza felt pieces clicking into place. "Mr. Mercer, Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. How much do you trust Garrett and Coleman?" "Garrett's been here since before I was born. Coleman came on about 10 years ago. My father trusted them both." He met her eyes. "But my father was here, overseeing everything. He knew every detail of ranch operations. I don't. I've been trying to learn while also managing everything else, and there are gaps in my knowledge that someone could exploit. Then I need to dig deeper. But that means asking difficult questions and potentially creating conflict. Do it. I'd rather have conflict than continue bleeding money we can't afford to lose." He stood, determination settling over his features. "You have full authority to investigate whatever you need to. If anyone gives you trouble, they answer to me." "Coleman already tried to warn me off." Caleb's jaw tightened. "When?" "This morning. He suggested I might jump to wrong conclusions if I didn't understand how ranch operations work." "That son of a—" Caleb caught himself. "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly, but the implication was clear. I'll speak with him." "No." Eliza surprised herself with the firmness of her tone. "If you confront him now, he'll know I reported the conversation, and it'll make my investigation harder. Let me work quietly for a few more days. If I find evidence of wrongdoing, then you act." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. "Fine. But if he approaches you again, I want to know immediately." "Agreed." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Eliza, I want you to know, I'm grateful you're here. I know yesterday was terrible, and you'd have every right to leave. But you're doing exactly what this ranch needs, and I won't forget that. Just doing my job. It's more than that. You're choosing to stay when you could run. That means something." After he left, Eliza sat alone in the quiet office, thinking about trust and betrayal, about men who built empires and men who stole from them, about a young woman from St. Louis who'd somehow ended up in the middle of a frontier power struggle. She pulled the next ledger toward her and got back to work. The afternoon passed in a blur of numbers and cross-references. Eliza worked methodically, building a clearer picture of the ranch's finances. The pattern was subtle but consistent, small amounts siphoned off here and there, never enough to be immediately obvious, but adding up to significant losses over time. She was so focused that she didn't hear footsteps approaching until someone cleared their throat in the doorway. Garrett stood there, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Ward, may I come in?" Every instinct told her to refuse, but she nodded. "Mr. Garrett." He entered slowly, like approaching a skittish horse. "I owe you an apology. What I did yesterday was wrong. I let my frustration with the ranch's situation color my judgment, and you paid the price for that." Eliza set down her pen, studying him. The apology seemed genuine, but she'd learned long ago that sincerity didn't always mean trustworthiness. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that it won't happen again. Mercer made it clear, very clear, that you're here to work in the house and on the books, and that's how it'll be." "Thank you." Garrett shifted his weight, glancing at the organized stacks of papers. "Mercer says you've found some irregularities in the accounts." There it was, the real reason for this visit. "I found some discrepancies that need investigation," Eliza said neutrally. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind I need to verify before discussing with anyone other than Mr. Mercer. I handle most of the ranch's business transactions. If there are problems with the records, I might be able to explain them." "I'm sure you could. When I have specific questions, I'll bring them to you." Garrett's expression hardened slightly. "Look, Miss Ward, I'm trying to help. I know these books look like a mess, but there are reasons for some of the inconsistencies. This is a working ranch, not a city business. Things don't always follow neat patterns. I understand, and when I need clarification on ranch operations, I'll ask." They stared at each other, and Eliza saw the moment Garrett realized she wasn't going to be intimidated or manipulated into sharing what she'd found. His jaw tightened. "Fine, but don't go jumping to conclusions without understanding context. This ranch is more complicated than you think." "I'm sure it is." He left without another word, and Eliza let out a slow breath. First Coleman, now Garrett, both of them trying to warn her off, to suggest she didn't understand enough to question what she was finding, which only convinced her that she was on the right track. She worked until the light faded and her eyes burned from strain. Mary brought dinner to the office, a kindness Eliza accepted gratefully, not wanting to face the hall full of men again. She ate while reviewing notes, planning her next steps. Tomorrow, she'd start cross-referencing supply orders against actual deliveries. If materials were being ordered but not arriving, or if quantities were being inflated, that would show in the physical inventory. But doing that inventory would require access to the supply sheds and cooperation from whoever managed them. Coleman's territory. She was contemplating how to navigate that when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "It's late. You should rest." Caleb stood in the doorway, carrying a lamp. He looked exhausted, dirt-streaked, and worn. "I could say the same to you," Eliza replied. "Fair point." He entered, setting the lamp on the desk. "I wanted to check on you. Garrett said he stopped by." "He did. Wanted to apologize for yesterday and offer to explain any discrepancies I found." "Bet he did." Caleb pulled up a chair. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd bring questions to him when I had them. Nothing specific." "Good. I don't want him knowing exactly what you're looking at until we have solid evidence of something wrong." "Do you think he's involved?" Eliza asked directly. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to believe it. Garrett's been part of this ranch my whole life. He taught me to ride, to manage cattle, to read the weather. My father trusted him completely." "That's not an answer." "No, it's not." He rubbed his face tiredly. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me thinks he's just a hard man trying to run operations the best he can. Another part wonders if I've been blind to things happening right under my nose." "And Coleman?" "Coleman's harder to read. He's competent, handles logistics well, keeps the supply chains moving, but I've never quite trusted him the way my father trusted Garrett." Caleb met her eyes. "My instinct says if something's wrong, Coleman's more likely to be involved. But instinct isn't evidence." "No, it's not. Which is why I need to keep digging." "How are your hands?" Caleb asked, changing the subject. Eliza looked down at the bandages, now stained with ink and dirt. "Healing. Still sore, but functional." "Mary said they were badly torn. I'm sorry you had to go through that. It taught me something important about this place, about what some people here think of me." "And what's that?" "That I'll have to prove myself over and over, that nothing will come easy, that there are people who want me to fail." She straightened her shoulders. "But I've dealt with that my whole life. This is just a different setting." Caleb smiled slightly. "You're tougher than you look." "I have to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the lamplight casting long shadows across the office. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch drifted in, cattle lowing in the distance, horses shifting in their stalls, the wind moving through the grass. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said. "Why did you come west? Mary said you had a position in St. Louis. Had been the key word. The firm I worked for changed hands, and the new owner didn't want a woman managing accounts. He gave my position to his nephew and offered me secretarial work at half the pay. So you left. So I had no reason to stay. No family, no prospects, no future there. The advertisement for this position seemed like a chance to start over somewhere no one knew me or had predetermined ideas about what I could do. How's that working out so far? Caleb asked Riley. Eliza laughed, a real laugh that surprised her. About as well as you'd expect. Turns out people have predetermined ideas everywhere. True, but at least here you get to prove them wrong on your own terms. Is that what you're doing? Proving something? Every day. Caleb's expression grew serious. My father built this ranch from nothing. Everyone expected me to run it into the ground within a year of his death. Some people are still waiting for that to happen. Are you going to let them see it? Not if I can help it. Not if I can find the right people to work with. He stood, picking up his lamp. Get some rest, Eliza. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. For both of us, it seems. Unfortunately. He left, and Eliza tidied her workspace, organizing her notes and locking the sensitive ledgers in the desk drawer. Her room felt warmer tonight, less isolated. Maybe because she was too tired to care, or maybe because she was starting to feel less like an outsider. She changed into her nightclothes awkwardly, her hands still clumsy with the bandages, and collapsed into bed. Sleep came easier than the night before, though her dreams were filled with numbers that didn't add up and voices warning her to stop asking questions. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Eliza worked from dawn to dusk, methodically building her case. She cross-referenced supply orders against inventory, tracked livestock sales against market prices, and mapped payroll against actual workers present. The picture that emerged was damning. Someone had been systematically skimming money from the ranch for at least a year, possibly longer. Supply orders inflated by 10 to 15%, with the extra going somewhere other than ranch storage. Livestock sales underreported by a few head here and there, not enough to be obvious, but enough to divert hundreds of dollars. Payroll padding with ghost workers who appeared on paper but never showed up in person. The common thread was Coleman. His signature appeared on most of the problematic documents, but Garrett's name was there too, countersigning orders and approving payments. Either they were working together or one was forging the other's approval. Eliza needed proof. Real, undeniable proof that would hold up against denial and excuses. On the fourth morning, she made her move. She found Sam in the equipment shed repairing a broken harness. He looked up as she entered, surprise crossing his face. Miss Ward, something I can help you with? Actually, yes. I need to do a physical inventory of our supply storage. Could you show me where everything's kept? Sam set down his tools slowly. That's usually Coleman's territory. He manages all the supplies. I know, but I need to verify our stock levels against our purchase records. It's part of reviewing the ranch's financial situation. Coleman know you're doing this? Mr. Mercer authorized me to access any records or facilities necessary for the review. Sam studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, follow me. The supply shed was massive, filled with everything from grain and feed to tools and hardware. Sam showed her the layout, explaining the organization system. Coleman keeps a log of what comes in and goes out, Sam said, pointing to a ledger hanging near the door. Supposed to match against the purchase orders. Supposed to, Sam shrugged. I just fix things when they break, but I've noticed sometimes the quantities don't seem right. We'll order a certain amount, but what shows up is less. How much less? Depends. Sometimes just a little, sometimes more. He lowered his voice. I mentioned it to Garrett once. He told me suppliers make mistakes, and Coleman handles returns and adjustments. Eliza felt her pulse quicken. Did Coleman ever show you documentation of those returns and adjustments? Never asked. Wasn't my business. Can I see Coleman's supply log? Sam handed it over, and Eliza compared it against her notes from the financial records. The discrepancies were there, clear as day. Orders for 100 pounds of grain with only 80 recorded as received. Purchase of 50 fence posts, inventory showing 35. The differences exactly matched the inflated amounts in the purchase orders. Someone was buying supplies at inflated prices, receiving less than ordered, and pocketing the difference. Sam, has anyone ever counted the actual inventory against these logs? Not that I know of. Coleman handles it all. Would you be willing to help me do a count? Today? Sam glanced toward the shed entrance nervously. If Coleman finds out, Mr. Mercer authorized this review. If Coleman has a problem, he can take it up with him. All right, but let's work fast. They spent the next 4 hours counting every item in the supply shed, comparing physical quantities against Coleman's logs and the purchase orders. The pattern held across the board, consistent shortfalls that added up to hundreds of dollars in missing supplies. Either the suppliers were systematically shorting the ranch, or someone was diverting materials after delivery. Eliza was recording the final counts when she heard footsteps outside the shed. Well, this is interesting. Coleman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression dark. Miss Ward, Sam, mind telling me what you're doing in my supply shed? Eliza straightened, meeting Coleman's stare without flinching. Sam shifted uncomfortably beside her, tools still in hand from the counting they'd been doing. Conducting an inventory, Eliza said evenly, as authorized by Mr. Mercer. Authorized? Coleman's voice dripped with contempt. And did Mercer authorize you to waste Sam's time, to rifle through records that are my responsibility? He does. He authorized me to review all ranch operations as they pertain to financial management. Supply inventory is part of that review. Coleman stepped into the shed, and Eliza noticed his hand rested on the knife at his belt, not threatening exactly, but positioned. You know what I think, Miss Ward? I think you're overstepping. I think you've been here less than a week and you're acting like you own the place. I'm doing my job. Your job is to sit in that office and pretend to understand numbers, not to come out here making accusations against men who've been running this ranch since before you were born. I haven't made any accusations. Haven't you? He gestured at her notes, counting inventory like you think I've been stealing, questioning records like you don't trust the system we've had in place for years. Sam cleared his throat. Coleman, she just asked to see how things were organized, wasn't trying to... I didn't ask you, Sam. In fact, why don't you get back to actual work? I need to have a word with Miss Ward, privately. The threat was unmistakable. Sam looked at Eliza, clearly torn between following orders and leaving her alone with a man who radiated hostility. That won't be necessary, a new voice said from the doorway. Caleb stood there, covered in dust from writing, but his eyes were sharp and focused. Sam, thank you for helping Miss Ward. I appreciate your cooperation. Sam nodded quickly and slipped past Coleman, heading for the exit. The tension in the shed ratcheted higher. Mr. Mercer, Coleman said, his tone shifting to something more respectful but still edged with anger. I was just explaining to Miss Ward that she should check with me before accessing supply areas. Why? Caleb asked simply. Coleman blinked. Because I manage supplies. It's my responsibility to know what's coming and going. And Miss Ward is responsible for verifying that our financial records match reality, which requires her to access supply areas. Caleb moved into the shed, positioning himself between Coleman and Eliza. Is there a reason you don't want her reviewing the inventory? No reason, just seems like she could have asked first. Professional courtesy. She has my authorization. That should be courtesy enough. Caleb glanced at Eliza's notes. What have you found? Eliza hesitated, aware of Coleman's eyes boring into her. But Caleb had asked a direct question, and she'd promised him honesty. Discrepancies between purchase orders, inventory logs, and physical counts. Consistent shortfalls across multiple categories of supplies. How much? I'm still calculating the exact amount, but based on what we've counted so far, I'd estimate several $100s worth of materials that were purchased but aren't accounted for in current inventory. Coleman's face went red. That's ridiculous. Supplies get used. That's the whole point of buying them. I'm comparing against usage rates documented in the logs, Eliza said. The shortfalls exceed normal consumption. Maybe the logs are wrong. Maybe I made mistakes in recording. It's not like I sit around with perfect penmanship all day. I'm working. Maybe, Eliza agreed. That's why I'm verifying before making any conclusions. Sounds like you've already made conclusions. Sounds like you're calling me a thief. I'm calling the numbers inconsistent. There's a difference. Coleman took a step toward her, and Caleb moved smoothly to intercept. That's enough, Coleman. Miss Ward is doing exactly what I asked her to do. If there are legitimate explanations for the discrepancies, we'll sort them out. But there's no reason for this conversation to get heated. No reason? Coleman's voice rose. She's questioning my integrity. She's accusing me of stealing from this ranch after 10 years of loyal service. And you're taking her side, some woman who showed up less than a week ago and doesn't know a damn thing about how we operate. I'm not taking sides. I'm looking for facts. Caleb's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. And right now, the facts suggest we have accounting problems that need investigation. If you're not involved in any wrongdoing, this investigation will clear you. And if I am involved? Coleman asked, his voice dropping to something dangerous. What then? You going to fire me? Good luck running this place without someone managing supplies. Good luck finding another man willing to work for what you pay, out here in the middle of nowhere. If you're stealing from this ranch, you'll be gone by nightfall. And you'll be lucky if I don't have the marshal investigate further. The two men stared at each other, and Eliza saw the moment Coleman realized Caleb wasn't bluffing. Something shifted in his expression, calculation replacing anger. Fine, Coleman said. You want to waste time investigating nothing, go ahead. But when you realize this is all a mistake, don't expect me to forget how you treated me. He pushed past Caleb and stalked out of the shed. They heard his boots crunching across the yard, then silence. Caleb turned to Eliza, his expression tight with concern. Are you all right? I'm fine. He's dangerous when he's cornered. You need to be careful. I know. Eliza gathered her notes, hands shaking slightly despite her calm tone. But we need to finish this investigation. What I've found so far is enough to raise serious questions, but not enough to prove anything definitively. What do you need? Access to the records of actual deliveries, bills of lading, delivery receipts, anything that shows what physically arrived versus what was ordered. Those would be in Coleman's office in the bunkhouse. He's not going to let you just walk in and take them. Then we'll need to get them another way. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. This is getting complicated. It was always complicated. We're just seeing it clearly now. Eliza met his eyes. But I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Are you prepared to follow this through? If the evidence points to Coleman, or Garrett, or both, are you ready to do what needs to be done? You think Garrett's involved? His signature is on a lot of the problematic documents. Either he's part of it, or someone's forging his approval. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ranch that had been his family's legacy. When my father was dying, he told me the hardest part of running this place wouldn't be the work, or the weather, or the market prices. It would be knowing who to trust. What did you say? I told him I'd trust the people he trusted. Garrett, Coleman, the men who'd been here for years. He laughed bitterly. Turns out that might have been the wrong answer. Or maybe things changed after he died. Maybe opportunities appeared that weren't there before. Maybe. Caleb straightened his shoulders, and Eliza saw the resolve settle over him. Yes, I'm prepared to follow this through. If someone's stealing from this ranch, they're stealing from every worker who depends on it for their livelihood. They're stealing from the future I'm trying to build. I won't tolerate that, no matter who's involved. Good. Then let's finish this properly. They walked back to the main house together, and Eliza was aware of eyes watching from various points around the ranch. Word would spread fast about the confrontation in the supply shed. By dinner, everyone would know that she'd challenged Coleman and Caleb had backed her. The sides were being drawn. That evening, Eliza worked late in the office, compiling her evidence into a comprehensive report. She documented every discrepancy, cross-referenced every suspicious transaction, and built a timeline that showed the pattern of theft extending back at least 18 months. The numbers were damning. Between inflated supply orders, underreported livestock sales, and ghost workers on the payroll, someone had siphoned nearly $4,000 from the ranch. For a struggling operation like this, it was the difference between survival and failure. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway until they were right outside the office. The door opened without a knock. Garrett stood there, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. Working late? There's a lot to do. Eliza closed the ledger she'd been reviewing, not wanting him to see what she was documenting. I heard about what happened with Coleman today. News travels fast. It does on a ranch. Garrett entered uninvited, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch made Eliza's pulse quicken. Want to tell me what you think you found? When my investigation is complete, I'll present my findings to Mr. Mercer. Then he can decide what to share with ranch management. Ranch management. That's me, in case you forgot. I run the day-to-day operations here. Anything that affects this ranch affects my ability to do my job. I understand that. Do you? Garrett moved closer to the desk. Because it seems to me you're stirring up trouble without considering the consequences. Coleman's angry. The men are talking. Some of them think you're trying to make yourself important by inventing problems. The problems aren't invented. The numbers don't lie. Numbers can be interpreted different ways. Mistakes happen. This isn't a bank in St. Louis where everything balances perfectly. This is a working ranch where things get messy. I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that the patterns I'm seeing go beyond normal messiness. Garrett's jaw tightened. You need to be very careful, Miss Ward. You're making enemies among men who have long memories and short tempers. Out here, that can be dangerous. Is that a threat? It's a warning. I don't know what Mercer told you, but this ranch has always worked a certain way. We have systems, relationships, understandings that keep things running. You come in and upset those systems, you might find you've created problems bigger than you can handle. Eliza stood, refusing to be intimidated by his looming presence. Mr. Garrett, I'm going to say this once. I'm here to do a job, and I'm going to do it regardless of who gets uncomfortable. If you or anyone else has been conducting business honestly, you have nothing to worry about. If you haven't, then yes, you should be worried. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. Garrett leaned on the desk, his face inches from hers. But nerve only gets you so far. At some point, you need to know when to back down. I don't back down when I'm right. And if you're wrong, if you've misunderstood something and you cost good men their jobs over your mistakes, then I'll answer for that. But I'm not wrong. They stared at each other in tense silence. Finally, Garrett straightened, shaking his head. Mercer's making a mistake putting faith in you. You're going to tear this place apart. Or maybe I'm going to save it. Garrett left without another word, and Eliza had to sit down before her legs gave out. Her hands were shaking again, and she felt sick with adrenaline. 2 confrontations in one day with men who saw her as a threat. Men who had the power and connections to make her life very difficult. But she'd meant what she said. She wasn't backing down. She worked for another hour, finalizing her report. When it was complete, she had a 20-page document that laid out every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction, every piece of evidence that pointed to systematic theft. It wasn't proof that would hold up in a court of law, but it was more than enough to justify action. The question was what action Caleb would take. She found him in the dining hall, eating a late dinner alone. He looked up as she entered and seemed to read something in her expression. It's done? Yes. She handed him the report. Everything I found, organized chronologically. You should read it before we discuss next steps. Caleb took the document, glancing at the first few pages. His expression grew darker with each line he read. This is worse than I thought. Yes. You're certain about these numbers? I verified everything multiple times. The pattern is clear. He set the report down, rubbing his eyes tiredly. Coleman and Garrett both came to me this evening, separately. Both of them complained that you were overstepping, making unfounded accusations, causing problems. And what did you tell them? That you were doing your job and they needed to cooperate. He picked up the report again. But Garrett made a point I can't ignore. If I move against them based on this, especially if I fire them, I could lose half my workforce. A lot of the men are loyal to Garrett. They respect him, trust his leadership. If he goes, they might go too. So you're going to let them keep stealing? No, I'm saying we need to be smart about how we handle this. Caleb stood, pacing. I need more than numbers. I need something concrete. Evidence that even Garrett can't explain away. Like what? Like catching them in the act, or finding where the stolen money and goods are going. Eliza considered this. The next supply delivery is scheduled for 3 days from now. Large order of winter feed and equipment. If the pattern holds, it'll be inflated in the purchase order, and the actual delivery will be short. So we verify the delivery ourselves, count everything that arrives before Coleman has a chance to record it. He'll know what we're doing. Let him know. If he's innocent, he'll have no problem with us double-checking. If he's guilty, maybe the pressure will make him slip up. It was risky, but Eliza couldn't think of a better option. All right, but we'll need help. Someone to watch the delivery, someone Coleman doesn't control. Miller, Caleb said immediately. He's honest. He's got no loyalty to Coleman, and he's good at details. You trust him? With my life. Over the next 3 days, the tension on the ranch became unbearable. Coleman avoided Eliza completely, communicating only through curt notes left with Mary. Garrett maintained a cold professionalism, but his eyes followed her whenever they crossed paths. The men whispered in corners, and conversations died when she entered a room. Only a few people remained openly friendly. Mary continued bringing her meals and checking on her well-being. Miller stopped by the office occasionally to chat, providing updates on ranch gossip. Sam gave her subtle nods of support when no one else was watching. But even with these allies, Eliza felt the isolation keenly. She was an outsider challenging the established order, and the ranch was circling its wagons against her. Caleb felt it too. She could see the strain wearing on him, the weight of choosing between his inherited trust in men like Garrett and the evidence that trust might be misplaced. He spent long hours riding the property alone, avoiding the house and the decisions waiting there. The morning of the delivery, Eliza woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. This was it, the moment that would either vindicate her investigation or reveal her as paranoid and destructive. She dressed carefully in her practical cotton dress, wrapped her nearly healed hands in fresh bandages, and headed downstairs. Caleb was already in the dining hall with Miller, both of them looking tense. "Morning," Caleb said. "The supply wagon should arrive around mid-morning. Miller's going to be at the gate to count everything as it's unloaded. I'll be there too, officially to inspect the quality of the winter feed." "And Coleman?" Eliza asked. "He knows we're checking the delivery. I told him we've had quality issues with this supplier before and want to verify everything." "Did he buy it?" "No, but he can't object without looking suspicious." They ate breakfast in silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on all of them. If they were right, this would expose theft and corruption at the highest levels of ranch management. If they were wrong, it would destroy whatever fragile trust remained. The supply wagon arrived at 10:30, pulled by 6 heavy horses and loaded with sacks of feed, equipment, and miscellaneous supplies. The driver was a grizzled man in his 50s who looked annoyed at having to make the long journey out to the ranch. Coleman was already at the gate, clipboard in hand, looking calm and professional. He nodded to Caleb without warmth. "Mr. Mercer, you're inspecting the delivery yourself today?" "That's right. Want to make sure we're getting what we paid for." "Of course. Though I assure you, I always verify counts." "I'm sure you do." The tension was thick enough to cut. The driver looked between them nervously. "Someone want to tell me where to unload?" "Right here is fine," Coleman said. "We'll count as you bring it down." What followed was 2 hours of meticulous, uncomfortable inventory. Every sack of feed weighed and counted. Every piece of equipment examined and checked against the order list. Miller kept a tally sheet, calling out numbers that Caleb verified against the purchase order. And with each count, the discrepancy became clearer. The purchase order specified 200 sacks of winter feed at $12 per sack. The delivery contained 160 sacks. The order listed 30 coils of barbed wire. 22 coils came off the wagon. Tools, hardware, equipment, every category showed the same pattern. The physical delivery was consistently short by 15 to 20% of the ordered amount. Coleman's face grew progressively paler as the count continued. By the time they reached the last items, his hands were shaking. "There must be a mistake," he said, his voice strained. "Driver, are you sure this is the complete delivery for the Mercer Ranch?" The driver checked his manifest. "Says here everything on this list. That's what I loaded in town. That's what I'm delivering." "But the purchase order? I don't know about purchase orders, friend. I deliver what's on my manifest. You got questions? Take it up with the supplier." Caleb held up the purchase order and the manifest side by side. "These don't match. The order we placed is different from what the supplier loaded." Coleman reached for the documents, but Caleb pulled them back. "Not yet. Miller, what's the total count difference?" Miller consulted his tally sheet. "Based on the purchase order prices, we paid for about $800 more in supplies than we actually received." $800 in a single delivery. Coleman's eyes darted between Caleb, the driver, and Miller. "This is the supplier's fault. They shorted us. I'll file a complaint, get a refund." "Will you?" Caleb's voice was quiet but hard. "Because I'm looking at this purchase order, and I noticed something interesting. The supplier's copy at the bottom shows the original quantities, the ones that match what was delivered. But our copy shows higher quantities. Someone altered our copy after the order was placed. That's impossible. Maybe the supplier made the changes. The ink's different, Coleman. Look at it. The higher quantities are written in different ink than the rest of the order. Eliza watched Coleman's face as the lies crumbled. His expression went through shock, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of desperate defiance. You can't prove I did anything. Maybe Garrett made those changes. Maybe someone else. Maybe... Your handwriting, Miller said quietly. The altered numbers are in your handwriting. I've seen your supply logs often enough to recognize it. The silence that followed was deafening. The driver backed away slowly, clearly wanting no part of whatever was happening. Caleb stood perfectly still, the documents in his hand damning in their clarity. Coleman's face twisted. You think you're so smart, don't you? You and your pet accountant playing detective. You have no idea what it takes to keep this place running. So you admit it, Caleb said flatly. I admit I did what I had to do to survive. You think your father paid me enough to live on? To save anything? I've given this ranch 10 years of my life, and what do I have to show for it? Nothing. So, yes, I took a little extra. Compensation for being underpaid and underappreciated. A little extra. You've stolen thousands of dollars. And you've wasted thousands on stupid decisions and poor management. At least I was smart about it. Caleb's jaw tightened. Get off my property. You have until sunset to pack your things and leave. If you're still here after that, I'll have the marshal come get you. You'll regret this, Coleman snarled. You're going to find out how hard it is to run this place without me. You'll come crawling back begging, leave now. For a moment, Eliza thought Coleman might actually attack Caleb. His hands clenched into fists, his face red with rage. But then he seemed to deflate, realizing he'd lost. Fine, but this isn't over. I know things about this ranch, about Garrett, about your precious father, things that would make you sick. You want to play righteous? Let's see how righteous you feel when I start talking. He stormed off toward the bunkhouse. Caleb watched him go, his expression unreadable. That went well, Miller said dryly. It went terribly, Caleb replied. And it's about to get worse. He was right. Within an hour, word of Coleman's firing had spread through the entire ranch. Men gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. Some looked satisfied. Coleman had never been well liked. But others looked worried, uncertain about what this meant for the stability of the operation. And Garrett was nowhere to be found. Eliza was in the office, updating her records with the delivery discrepancy evidence, when Mary appeared in the doorway looking worried. You should know. There's talk of some men leaving. They're saying if Mercer's going to start firing people over small mistakes, they'd rather find work elsewhere. Small mistakes? Coleman was stealing. I know that. You know that. But Garrett's been talking to the men, and he's framing it differently. Says Coleman made some accounting errors and Mercer overreacted. Says you've got too much influence and you're turning Mercer against the workers. Eliza felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Where's Caleb? Out in the south pasture, last I heard. He doesn't know what's happening yet. We need to tell him. Might be too late. Some of the men are already packing. Eliza found Caleb an hour later near the horse stables, talking with Tom Richards. Both men looked grim. How many? Caleb asked as she approached. 7 so far, Tom said. Garrett's convinced them you're going to start finding fault with everyone, that no one's job is safe. That's not... Caleb caught himself, frustration clear on his face. Where is Garrett? Bunkhouse, talking to more men. Caleb looked at Eliza, and she saw the doubt creeping in. Is this worth it? Losing a third of my workforce over Coleman's theft? Is keeping thieves and liars worth it? She countered. Because that's the alternative. Maybe there's a middle ground. Keep Garrett on. Make it clear that Coleman acted alone. Did he act alone? Eliza asked. Because Garrett's signature is on a lot of those documents. Either he knew what Coleman was doing, or he was negligent enough that he might as well have known. You don't know that for certain. No, I don't. But I know he's out there right now poisoning the men against you because you chose to do the right thing. That tells me a lot about his character. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened, and Eliza saw decision settle over his features. Tom, call everyone to the main hall. Everyone working today. I need to address the whole crew. Are you sure that's wise? Tom asked. Emotions are running high. That's exactly why I need to do it. This ends now, one way or another. 30 minutes later, every man on the ranch was gathered in the dining hall. The atmosphere was tense, suspicious, divided. Garrett stood near the back with a group of the older workers, his expression carefully neutral. Miller was near the front with Sam and a few others who'd been supportive of Eliza. The rest filled the space between, uncertain where they stood. Caleb stood at the head of the room with Eliza beside him. She could feel the weight of their stares, the resentment from some, the curiosity from others. "I know there's been a lot of talk today," Caleb began, "about Coleman, about changes on this ranch, about what all of this means. So I want to be clear about what happened and where we go from here." He paused, making eye contact with various men around the room. Coleman was fired because he was stealing from this ranch, not making mistakes, not errors in accounting, deliberate theft that's been going on for over a year. Miss Ward uncovered evidence that Coleman was inflating purchase orders and pocketing the difference. Today we caught him red-handed with a delivery that was short by $800. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Garrett's expression didn't change. Now, some of you might be thinking that's not your problem. That as long as you get paid, what does it matter if Coleman skimmed a little? Here's why it matters. That $4,000 he stole? That's money that could have gone to better wages, to hiring the extra men we need, to upgrading equipment so your jobs are easier and safer. Caleb's voice grew harder. Coleman stole from every single one of you. He made this ranch weaker, made your jobs harder, and he did it while pretending to be one of you. That's not a small mistake. That's betrayal. "And what about the rest of us?" someone called out. "How do we know you're not going to start finding fault with everyone?" "You know, because I'm telling you right now, if you do your job honestly, you have nothing to fear. If you make honest mistakes, we'll fix them together. But if you're stealing, if you're lying, if you're sabotaging this operation, then yes, you should be worried." Garrett stepped forward. "That's a fine speech, Mr. Mercer, but it doesn't change the fact that you've put a lot of faith in someone who's been here less than 2 weeks. Miss Ward comes in, starts making accusations, and suddenly you're turning against men who've been loyal to this ranch for years. Men like you, Garrett." The room went dead silent. "Because your signature is on a lot of those documents Coleman falsified, which means either you were part of his scheme, or you were so negligent in your duties that you let it happen right under your nose." Garrett's face flushed. "I trusted Coleman. That's not a crime." "No, but stealing is. And I need to know, were you part of it?" "I can't believe you're asking me that. After everything I've done for this ranch, for your family." "Answer the question, Garrett, yes or no." The tension was unbearable. Eliza held her breath, aware that everything hinged on this moment. Garrett looked around the room at the men watching, at the ranch he'd helped build, at the young man questioning his integrity. Something in his expression shifted, pride giving way to something harder to define. "No," he said finally. "I wasn't part of Coleman's theft, but I should have caught it. You're right about that. I was so focused on managing the day-to-day that I didn't pay attention to what was happening with the money. That's on me." "Then why are you turning the men against me for fixing it?" Garrett's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Because I don't like how you're going about it. Coming in, changing everything, trusting her over men who've been here for years. I'm not trusting her over you. I'm trusting evidence over assumptions. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're letting some city woman tell you how to run your ranch." Eliza had stayed quiet through the exchange, but this she couldn't let pass. "Mr. Garrett, I'm not telling anyone how to run a ranch. I'm telling you what the numbers say. And the numbers say this operation has been hemorrhaging money that should have been caught months ago." "Maybe if Mercer had been doing his own bookkeeping instead of pawning it off." "I couldn't do my own bookkeeping," Caleb interrupted. "I was trying to do everything myself and failing at most of it. That's why I needed help, real help, from someone with skills I don't have." He looked around the room, meeting eyes. "My father built this ranch from nothing. He knew how to do everything, manage cattle, handle accounts, lead men. I'm not my father. I'm learning and I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm also going to hire people who can fill the gaps in my knowledge. That's not weakness. That's how successful operations work." "And if those people are wrong," someone asked, "if Miss Ward made mistakes in her investigation, then I'll own that. But she didn't make mistakes. The evidence is clear, and anyone who wants to review it is welcome to do so." Caleb paused. Here's what's going to happen. Anyone who wants to leave, you're free to go. I'll pay you through the end of the week. No hard feelings. But if you stay, it's with the understanding that things are going to change on this ranch. What kind of changes? Tom asked. More transparency, clear expectations, fair treatment based on merit, not seniority, and zero tolerance for theft or corruption. Caleb glanced at Eliza. Miss Ward is going to continue reviewing our operations and implementing better systems. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. The room was quiet. Then Miller spoke up from the front. I'm staying. This ranch needs people who actually give a damn about making it work, not people who see it as a place to skim from. Same here, Sam said. Tom nodded slowly. I'll stay too, though I think we all need to adjust to how things are changing. One by one, men spoke up, some committing to stay, others expressing hesitation. When it was done, only 3 men besides Coleman had decided to leave. Not the mass exodus Garrett had implied might happen. Garrett stood alone at the back of the room, isolated by his own choices. He looked at Caleb with something that might have been regret or resentment, hard to tell which. I'll stay, he said finally, if you'll have me. But things between us, they're not going to be the same. No, Caleb agreed. They're not. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. The meeting broke up slowly, men filing out in small groups, talking in low voices. Eliza started to follow, but Caleb caught her arm gently. Wait. When the room was empty except for them, he turned to face her fully. He looked exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Thank you, he said, for pushing me to do this. I was ready to compromise, to take the easier path. You wouldn't let me. I just showed you the numbers. You made the hard choices. We made them together. He smiled slightly. And now we get to deal with the consequences together. What happens now? Now? Now we figure out how to run a ranch short several men, with a foreman who resents the changes and a whole operation that needs rebuilding from the ground up. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Should be simple. Nothing about this is simple. No, but at least it's honest. He looked at her seriously. You know they're going to blame you if things go wrong. You're the outsider, the one who disrupted everything. That's not fair, but it's how people think. I know. And you're still willing to stay? Eliza thought about her alternatives. She could leave, find another position somewhere else. Start over again in a new place where no one knew about this disaster. It would be easier. But easier had never been what she was looking for. I'm staying, she said. This isn't finished yet. No, Caleb agreed. It's just beginning. The first snow came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains in late October and blanketing the ranch in white silence. Eliza stood at the office window watching it fall, thick flakes that turned the world into something clean and unfamiliar. Behind her, the ledgers told a different story, one of shortage and strain, of a ranch trying to survive with fewer hands and a trust that had been shattered. 2 weeks had passed since Coleman's departure. The men who'd chosen to leave with him were gone, taking their experience and labor with them. The ones who remained worked twice as hard, but there was only so much that willingness could compensate for when winter work demanded bodies and strength. Caleb appeared in the doorway, shaking snow from his coat. His face was windburned, exhaustion carved into lines around his eyes. North fence needs repair before the real cold hits. Tom says we're short at least 2 men to get it done before the cattle drift. Can we hire replacements? Not until spring. No one wants to start ranch work heading into winter, and word's gotten around about the changes here. Some people think I'm too quick to fire. Others think I'm not traditional enough. He dropped into the chair across from her desk with a heavy sigh. Turns out building a reputation for integrity makes you less popular than I expected. Eliza set down her pen. You could rehire Coleman. Tell people it was a misunderstanding. Is that what you'd advise? No, but I'm asking what you want to do. Caleb's laugh was bitter. I want to have enough men to run this place properly. I want the community to stop looking at me like I betrayed some unspoken code. I want to stop second-guessing every decision I make. He met her eyes. But I'm not bringing back a thief, no matter how convenient it would be. Then we work with what we have. We're going to lose cattle this winter, maybe a lot of them. The men are doing their best, but we can't cover all the territory we need to. When spring comes and the losses add up, people are going to say I ruined this ranch over pride. Or they'll say you rebuilt it on honesty. That's a nice thought. Doesn't help the cattle that freeze or starve because we weren't there to move them. The weight in his voice made Eliza stand and move around the desk. She'd learned to read Caleb over these weeks, the way he carried tension in his shoulders, how his hands clenched when he was doubting himself, the particular quality of silence that meant he was wrestling with something he didn't want to say out loud. "What else is wrong?" she asked. "Garrett came to me this morning, said several of the men are questioning whether you should be making decisions about ranch operations. I don't make operational decisions. I handle the books. You recommended we reduce the breeding herd to save on winter feed costs. That's operational. That was a financial recommendation based on what we can afford. You made the decision." They don't see it that way. They see me taking advice from someone who's never worked cattle, never survived a hard winter out here, never done any of the things my father spent 40 years learning how to do. Caleb rubbed his face. "And honestly, sometimes I wonder if they're right. What if I'm making mistakes because I'm listening to theory instead of experience?" Eliza felt something cold settle in her chest. "You want me to stop advising you?" "No, I want—" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "I don't know what I want. I know the books look better since you reorganized everything. I know we're not hemorrhaging money anymore. But I also know we're barely holding on, and if we don't make it through this winter, all the good accounting in the world won't matter. So this is my fault. Coleman's theft, the men leaving, the winter coming early, all of it traces back to me disrupting things. That's not what I said." "It's what you're thinking." Caleb turned to face her, frustration and something else, something that looked like fear in his expression. "What I'm thinking is that I brought you here to help save this ranch, and instead I've started a war that might destroy it. And I don't know how to fix that without either giving up everything we've worked for or losing everything anyway." The silence stretched between them, heavy, with things neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Finally, Eliza spoke quietly. "I can leave. Tell people it didn't work out, that you need someone with more ranching experience. Bring in a man to handle the books, someone the crew will respect." "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. You need to save this ranch." "You didn't answer my question." Eliza looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd defended her when he didn't have to, who'd stood up to men he'd known his whole life because the numbers said it was right, who carried the weight of his father's legacy and his own doubts with equal measure. And she realized with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that what she wanted had become dangerously complicated. "No," she said, "I don't want to leave, but I will if that's what's best." Caleb crossed the space between them in 2 steps. "It's not best. It's easier, which isn't the same thing." His voice dropped. "You were right about Coleman. You were right about the money. And you're probably right about reducing the herd, even if it makes me sick to sell off cattle my father spent years breeding. I don't like that you're right, but I trust it. Trust doesn't keep cattle alive in a blizzard." "No. Hard work does. Smart planning does. And having someone who can tell you the truth even when you don't want to hear it, that helps too." He was close enough that Eliza could see the snowmelt in his hair, the rough stubble on his jaw, the intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. When had that started happening? When had Caleb Mercer stopped being just the ranch owner who'd hired her and become someone whose opinion mattered, whose presence made her heart beat faster, whose troubles felt like her own? "We should get back to work," she said, stepping back. "The inventory won't finish itself." Something flickered across Caleb's face, disappointment maybe, or relief. "Right. Work." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Eliza, thank you for staying, for caring about this place even when it would be easier not to. Someone has to care about the numbers." "That's not what I meant." After he left, Eliza sat down heavily, her hands shaking. This was dangerous territory. She'd come west to escape complications, to build something clean and professional and separate from the messy entanglements of emotion. She'd told herself that Caleb was her employer, nothing more. That the late nights working together, the shared meals, the conversations that ranged far beyond ranch business, all of it was just the natural result of isolation and proximity. But she was lying to herself. Had been for weeks. The snow continued to fall. Winter hit hard and stayed that way. November brought freezing rain that coated everything in ice. December came with winds that howled down from the peaks and cold that made breathing hurt. The men worked in brutal conditions, moving cattle to sheltered valleys, breaking ice on water sources, hauling feed to animals that couldn't forage through the deep snow. Eliza worked too, though her labor was different. She reorganized the supply systems to eliminate waste, renegotiated contracts with buyers to get better prices, and implemented a tracking system that showed exactly where every dollar went. The ranch's financial picture improved incrementally, not enough to solve their problems, but enough to give them a fighting chance. Mary taught her to cook for large groups, and soon Eliza was helping prepare meals for the crew. It started as a practical necessity. Mary couldn't handle it all alone, but it became something else, a way to contribute beyond the ledgers, a way to show the men that she was willing to work beside them, not just judge them from an office. "You're getting better at this," Mary said one evening as Eliza kneaded bread dough with hands that had finally healed into calluses. "When you first arrived, I thought you'd be gone within a month." "So did I," Eliza admitted. "What changed?" Eliza thought about it while working the dough. "I stopped trying to prove I belonged and started just doing the work. Belonging came later." "And Caleb, where does he fit into all this?" The question caught Eliza off guard. She glanced at Mary, who was watching her with knowing eyes. "He's my employer." "Is that all?" "That's all it can be." Mary made a non-committal sound. "You're both lying to yourselves, you know. Everyone sees how he looks at you, how you look at him when you think no one's watching." "It doesn't matter how we look. The ranch comes first. The ranch isn't going to keep either of you warm at night." "Mary..." "I'm just saying, life's hard out here, and it's harder alone. Don't be so focused on doing the right thing that you miss out on something good." Before Eliza could respond, Miller burst through the kitchen door, snow-covered and breathing hard. "Where's Mercer?" "In the barn, I think. Why?" "Storm's coming. Big one. Tom says we need to get the cattle in the south pasture moved now or we'll lose them." Mary was already moving, grabbing coats. "How many men does Tom need?" "Everyone, including you two, if you can ride." "I can ride," Eliza said, though her experience was limited to a few lessons Caleb had insisted she take. "Then get dressed warm. This is going to be rough." 20 minutes later, Eliza was on horseback, bundled in layers of wool and leather that Mary had pulled from storage. The cold bit through everything anyway, numbing her face and hands. Around her, the remaining ranch hands were mounting up, 10 men total, counting Caleb and Garrett. Not nearly enough for what they needed to do. Caleb rode over, his expression worried when he saw her. "You don't have to do this. You need every person you can get. It's dangerous. The cattle are half wild from being spooked by the weather. If they stampede, then I'll stay back with Mary and help from a distance, but I'm not sitting inside while everyone else risks their lives." He looked like he wanted to argue, but time was pressing. The sky had turned an ominous gray-green, and the wind was picking up. "Stay close to Miller. Do exactly what he says. If things go wrong, you ride for the house and don't look back." "I will." "Eliza, I mean it. Don't try to be a hero." "Same to you." They rode out into conditions that worsened by the minute. The snow that had been falling gently all morning turned into stinging pellets of ice. Visibility dropped until Eliza could barely see the rider ahead of her. The cold was unlike anything she'd experienced, painful and all-consuming, making every breath feel like inhaling knives. The cattle were scattered across a wide pasture, already agitated by the approaching storm. Getting them moving toward the shelter of the barns required careful coordination. Riders on all sides, pushing but not panicking them, maintaining formation even as the weather tried to tear everything apart. Eliza did her best to follow Miller's shouted instructions, moving where he directed, keeping her horse steady even though her hands could barely feel the reins. Around her, the other riders worked with practiced efficiency, but even their skill was tested by the conditions. They were halfway to the barns when things went wrong. A crack of lightning, rare in a winter storm, spooked the herd. The cattle broke formation, dozens of animals suddenly running in different directions. Eliza's horse reared, nearly throwing her. She clung to the saddle, terror sharp in her throat. "Get clear!" someone shouted. Garrett, maybe, or Tom. She couldn't tell through the wind and chaos. She tried to turn her horse, but the animal was panicked now, fighting her control. Then she saw one of the steers bearing down on her, eyes wild, 1,000 pounds of muscle and fear charging straight toward her position. Something hit her from the side, not the steer but another horse. Caleb's horse. He'd ridden between her and the charging animal, using his own mount to shield her and turn the steer aside. The impact sent both horses stumbling, and for a terrible moment Eliza thought they'd both go down. But Caleb knew how to ride, knew how to recover. He steadied his horse and grabbed her reins, pulling her mount under control. "You okay?" he shouted over the wind. "Yes! Get back to the house, now!" This time she didn't argue. She let him turn her horse and point it toward the distant lights of the ranch buildings. Then she rode, heart pounding, ice stinging her face, aware that she'd just come far too close to being trampled. She made it back and handed her horse to one of the stable hands who'd stayed behind. Then she went inside, shaking from cold and adrenaline, and waited. The others didn't return for another 3 hours. When they finally came back, they brought most of the cattle with them. Not all. They'd lost maybe a dozen in the chaos, but enough to call it a success. The men were frozen solid, barely able to dismount, their faces gray with exhaustion. Mary and Eliza had hot food and coffee waiting. The men ate in silence, too tired for conversation, then stumbled off to collapse in their bunks. Only Caleb remained, sitting at the long table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, staring at nothing. Eliza sat down across from him. "You saved my life out there. You shouldn't have been out there in the first place. You needed everyone. I needed you alive more than I needed you on a horse." He finally looked at her, and she saw fear still lingering in his eyes. "When I saw that steer charging, I thought—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought I was going to watch you die. But you didn't. You stopped it. Barely. Another second, and—" He shook his head. "You can't do things like that, Eliza. You can't risk yourself that way." "Why not? Everyone else does." "Because everyone else is replaceable. You're not." The words hung in the air between them. Eliza felt her heart hammering, and this time it wasn't from the cold or the fear. It was from the way Caleb was looking at her, like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. "Caleb, I know I shouldn't say this. I know it's inappropriate, that you work for me, that this could make everything more complicated, but I can't keep pretending anymore." He reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. "I care about you, more than I should, more than is probably smart, and I nearly lost you today, and I realized I can't keep that locked away anymore." Eliza should pull her hand back, should remind him about professional boundaries and the impropriety of employers and employees forming attachments, should protect both of them from this complication. Instead, she turned her hand over so their palms pressed together. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "I've been trying not to. Trying to focus on work and tell myself that what I feel is just gratitude or respect or isolation, but it's not. It's more than that." "What do we do about it?" "I don't know. This could make everything harder." "It could," Caleb agreed. "Or it could make everything make sense." He stood and moved around the table, pulling her to her feet. For a moment, they just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the questions and hope in his eyes. Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like Eliza had imagined. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and certain, carrying all the fear from the day and the weeks of restraint and the desperate relief of both of them being alive and together in this moment. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza was shaking again, but not from cold. "We should talk about this," she said, "about what it means, how to handle it with the men. Tomorrow, tonight, can we just—" He pulled her close again, his arms around her, his face buried in her hair. "Can we just be grateful we're both alive?" She held him just as tightly. "Yes." They stood like that for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the stove, finding comfort in each other's warmth and presence. Tomorrow would bring all the complications. Tonight was enough. The relationship changed everything and nothing. They kept it quiet at first, both of them aware that the crew was already unsettled by change. But in a place as small as the ranch, secrets didn't keep long. Mary knew immediately, of course. She just smiled knowingly and said nothing. Miller figured it out within a week, saw the way they looked at each other during meals, and gave Caleb a quiet nod of approval. Tom was slower to notice, but when he did, he pulled Eliza aside one morning. "You making him happy?" Tom asked bluntly. "I hope so." "Good. Boy's been carrying too much weight alone. Having a partner, a real partner, not just employees, that'll help. Some people might see it as inappropriate. Some people see everything as inappropriate. Those aren't the people whose opinions matter." Tom fixed her with a serious look. But if you hurt him, you'll answer to me. Understand? I understand. Garrett's reaction was harder to read. He watched them together with an expression that might have been disapproval or resignation or something else entirely. But he didn't say anything, didn't cause problems. He just continued doing his job with the same grim competence he'd always shown. Winter ground on, brutal and relentless. They lost more cattle to the cold and predators. Equipment broke down in the freezing temperatures. The work was endless and exhausting, and there were nights when Eliza fell into bed too tired to even undress properly. But there were also nights when she and Caleb sat by the fire in his father's old study, working through the books together, planning for spring, talking about the future they were trying to build. Nights when he'd read aloud from the scattered books in the office while she organized paperwork. Nights when conversation gave way to silence and then to touch. And they'd remind each other that even in the hardest times, they weren't alone. In January, Caleb asked her to marry him. They were in the study, snow piling up outside the window, and he'd been unusually quiet all evening. Finally, he set down the ledger he'd been pretending to read. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous. About us. About what we're building here." Eliza set down her pen, sensing this was important. "What about it? This ranch? It needs more than just good management. It needs people who are committed to it for the long term, who see it as more than just a job or a temporary situation. I'm committed to it. I know, and I'm committed to you, which is why I want to make this official, permanent." He pulled something from his pocket, a simple gold band worn and scratched. "This was my mother's. She died when I was young, but my father kept it. I'd like you to have it, if you'll marry me." Eliza stared at the ring, emotions tangling in her chest. "Caleb, are you asking because you love me, or because you think it'll help stabilize the ranch?" "Both. Is that wrong?" "I don't know. Maybe it's honest." "I do love you. I should have said that first." He took her hand. "I love how you don't back down from hard problems. How you care about things being right even when it would be easier to let them slide. How you've made this place better just by being here and refusing to accept that things have to stay broken. That's not love, that's respect. Can it be both?" He met her eyes. "Eliza, I'm not good with words like you are, but I know that I want to wake up next to you every morning. I know that when something good happens, you're the first person I want to tell. And when things are hard, you're the only person I want facing them with me. If that's not love, I don't know what is." Eliza felt tears prickling her eyes. From happiness or fear, she couldn't tell. "This won't be easy. People will talk. They'll say I married you for security, that you married me because you needed someone to run the house." "Let them talk. We know the truth." "Do we? Because sometimes I'm not sure what's real between us and what's just circumstance. We're both lonely, both struggling. How do we know we're not just clinging to the nearest source of comfort?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and pulled her to her feet. "Come with me." He led her through the house and out onto the porch. The night was brutally cold, the stars sharp overhead, the snow-covered landscape glowing faintly under the moon. "You see that?" he said, pointing toward the barns and pastures. "That's the ranch. That's what we're fighting to save. It's important, and it matters, and I'd do almost anything to keep it running." He turned to face her, his hands framing her face. "But if I had to choose between the ranch and you, I'd choose you, every time. That's how I know this is real." "You can't mean that. This ranch is your father's legacy, and you're my future. I can build another ranch. I can't build another you." Eliza searched his face, looking for doubt or deception and finding neither. Just certainty and love, and the kind of terrifying honesty that left no room for hiding. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He kissed her then, and the cold disappeared, replaced by warmth and possibility and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could build something that lasted. They married in February, on a day when the sun actually broke through the clouds and made the snow-covered world sparkle. Mary cried. Tom gave Eliza away since she had no family of her own. Miller stood up for Caleb. The circuit preacher who came through once a month performed the ceremony in the main hall, with the entire remaining crew as witnesses. It wasn't fancy. Eliza wore a simple dress Mary had helped her make, and Caleb wore his best shirt and the same worn boots he wore every day. The ceremony lasted maybe 20 minutes, and the celebration afterward was brief. There was still work to be done, after all. But when Caleb slid his mother's ring onto Eliza's finger and promised to love her through every season, good and hard, she felt something settle deep in her chest. This was real. This was theirs. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Garrett approached her after the ceremony, his expression unreadable. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer." "Thank you. I hope you know what you're getting into. This life, it's not easy, even when things are going well." "I know. Do you?" He glanced at Caleb, who was talking with Tom across the room. "Because I've watched a lot of people come west thinking they could handle the frontier. Most of them don't last. I've lasted this far." "You have," Garrett admitted. "And that counts for something. Just don't forget, loving someone and building a life with them in this country are two different things. One's about feeling, the other's about endurance." "I can endure." "We'll see." He walked away, and Eliza felt the familiar frustration Garrett always sparked in her. But she also heard the truth in his words. Love was the easy part, relatively speaking. The real test would be everything that came after. Spring arrived late that year, tentative and uncertain. The snow lingered into March, and when it finally melted, it revealed losses they'd anticipated but still hurt to see. 23 cattle dead from the winter, fences destroyed by ice and wind, equipment that had broken and couldn't be repaired until the ground thawed enough to work properly. But they'd survived. Against odds that had seemed impossible in December, the ranch had made it through. And when the grass finally started growing again and the first calves of the season were born, there was a feeling of fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting. Eliza worked through her first spring as Caleb's wife, learning the rhythms of the ranch in a new season. She still managed the books, but now she also helped with branding, with moving cattle to fresh pasture, with all the endless tasks that came with trying to rebuild what winter had torn down. Her hands, which had been soft when she arrived, were permanently calloused now. Her skin was sun-darkened and weather-worn. She could ride competently, rope adequately, and hold her own in conversations about livestock quality and grazing rotation. The woman who'd stepped off that wagon last fall felt like a different person entirely. One evening in late May, she and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. She was exhausted, every muscle aching from a day spent helping repair fence line. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from work that mattered. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked quietly. "Staying here, marrying me, choosing this life?" Eliza thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I miss hot baths and books and having more than 2 dresses to choose from. Sometimes I remember what it was like to not be constantly tired or worried about money." "That's not really an answer." "No, I don't regret it. This is hard, and some days I question my sanity. But it's mine, ours. We're building something real here, and that matters more than comfort." Caleb took her hand, rough palm against rough palm. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I do." "I know, and I love you too." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the stars began to appear. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. A horse whinnied in the barn. The ranch breathed around them, alive and demanding, and theirs to protect. It wasn't the life Eliza had imagined when she'd left St. Louis. It was harder, stranger, more brutal in its demands. But it was also more real than anything she'd known before. And sitting there with Caleb's hand in hers, and the future stretching out uncertain but possible, she wouldn't have traded it for anything. The years that followed were never easy, but they were honest. That counted for something. By the second summer, the ranch had stabilized enough to hire new men. Younger workers drawn by word that the Mercer Ranch paid fair wages and treated people decently. They weren't the experienced hands that had left, but they were willing to learn, and Caleb and Eliza built a different kind of operation around that willingness. Eliza discovered she had a talent for teaching. The bookkeeping system she'd created needed someone to maintain it, so she trained Miller to handle the day-to-day records while she focused on larger financial planning. When new workers arrived, she spent their first week showing them how the ranch operated from the business side, what things cost, where money came from, why decisions were made the way they were. Most ranchers kept their workers in the dark about finances. Eliza figured people worked harder when they understood what they were working toward. "You're making them too smart," Garrett said one afternoon, watching her explain profit margins to a new hire. Give workers too much information, and they start questioning everything. Good, Eliza replied. I want them to question things. Questioning is how we found Coleman's theft. And look how well that turned out. Lost half our crew over that righteousness. We lost thieves and people loyal to thieves. The ones who stayed are better workers. Garrett shook his head but didn't argue further. He'd never fully made peace with the changes, but he'd adapted. His relationship with Caleb remained strained, professional but lacking the warmth that had existed before. Sometimes Eliza caught him watching them with an expression that might have been regret, but he never said anything about it. In the 3rd year, Eliza got pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made working the books a struggle, fear that something would go wrong because everything in this life felt fragile and uncertain. Mary hovered like a protective hen, forcing her to rest, preparing special foods, sharing stories of her own children born decades ago in a different country. You're going to be fine, Mary said one evening when Eliza was feeling particularly miserable. Your body knows what to do. What if it doesn't? What if something goes wrong and there's no doctor close enough to help? Then we handle it. That's what we do out here. We handle things. Mary's hands were gentle on Eliza's shoulders. But borrowing trouble doesn't help. Save your energy for when real problems come. Caleb was terrified in a way that would have been endearing if it wasn't so exhausting. He wanted her to stop working entirely, to spend the pregnancy resting in bed. She refused. They argued about it more than once until finally Tom intervened. Boy, you're going to drive her crazy, Tom told Caleb bluntly. She's pregnant, not dying. Let her work until she can't, then respect when she says she needs to stop. What if something happens to her, to the baby? Then something happens, and you deal with it together. But wrapping her in cotton won't prevent that, and it'll just make her miserable in the meantime. Caleb backed off, though Eliza could see the worry never left his eyes. She tried to be patient with it, understanding that his fear came from love and the very real dangers of childbirth in a place far from medical help. But patience was hard when she felt like an invalid being watched constantly for signs of collapse. Their daughter was born in late winter, arriving 3 weeks early during a snowstorm that trapped them all at the ranch. Mary delivered her with the help of 2 ranch hands who'd assisted with difficult animal births, and figured the principles couldn't be that different. It was messy and painful and terrifying, and when it was over, Eliza held a tiny, furious creature who seemed determined to scream her way into the world. She's healthy, Mary said, wiping her own tears away. Strong lungs, all her fingers and toes. You did good. Caleb looked at his daughter with an expression of such overwhelming love and fear that Eliza felt her heart crack open. What do we name her? They'd discussed names for months, but never settled on one. Now, looking at this small person who existed because they'd chosen each other, Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them here. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. Garrett came to see the baby the next day, standing awkwardly in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Heard you had a girl. Would you like to meet her? Eliza asked. He approached slowly, looking down at the sleeping infant with an expression Eliza had never seen on his weathered face, something soft and almost wistful. She looks like Caleb did when he was born. Same determined little face. He was quiet for a moment. His mother would have been glad to see this. A new generation on this ranch. Did you know her well? Well enough. She was a good woman. Tough, like you. Had to be, to survive out here. He glanced at Eliza. I owe you an apology. Several, actually. Eliza waited, surprised. When you first arrived, I saw you as a threat to the way things had always worked. I treated you poorly because of that, and I'm sorry. You've been better for this ranch than I wanted to admit. Thank you for saying that. Don't thank me yet. I'm still not convinced that all your modern ideas are going to work long term, but I'm willing to admit I might have been wrong about you. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger. She's lucky. Growing up with parents who actually respect each other, that's rare. After he left, Caleb came in from checking the stock. He looked exhausted but happy, snow melting in his hair. How is she? Perfect. Sleeping finally. Eliza watched him gaze at their daughter with that same overwhelming expression. Garrett came by. He apologized. About time. He said your mother would have been happy to see Hope. Caleb's eyes shimmered with sudden moisture. She would have. She always wanted grandchildren, used to tell my father that was the whole point of building something, to pass it on. And now we are, passing it on. Yeah. He sat beside the bed, taking Eliza's hand. You scared me yesterday. When things got difficult and there was so much blood, I thought, what? But I didn't. We didn't. We're here, and she's here, and we're going to figure out how to raise a child on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. You make it sound so simple. It won't be. Nothing about our life is simple. But we'll manage. And they did, though managing looked different than Eliza had imagined. Hope grew from infant to toddler in an environment that was equal parts wonderful and terrifying. She took her first steps in the ranch office, pulling herself up on the desk where her mother worked. She learned to ride before she could properly walk, sitting in front of her father on his horse during inspections. The ranch hands became a collection of uncles who taught her to whistle and curse, much to Eliza's dismay and Caleb's poorly hidden amusement. The ranch itself continued to evolve. In their 5th year, Caleb made the decision to expand, not the herd, but the operation's scope. They began breeding horses specifically for ranch work, capitalizing on Tom's expertise. Eliza developed relationships with buyers in 3 states, negotiating contracts that brought more stable income than the volatile cattle market alone. They weren't rich. There were still years when they barely broke even, seasons when disease or weather or market crashes threatened everything. But they were stable in a way the ranch hadn't been before. The books balanced, the workers stayed. Slowly, other ranchers started asking Caleb for advice, curious about how he'd turned around an operation that should have failed. Tell them it wasn't me, Caleb said one evening. Tell them it was you. They won't listen if I say that. They want to hear it from another man. Then they're idiots. You're the one who made this work. We made it work, together. By their 8th year, Hope had a brother, a serious, quiet boy they named Samuel after Sam, who died the previous winter in a farming accident. The loss had hit the whole ranch hard, reminded them all how fragile life was out here. Little Samuel seemed to carry some of his namesake's gentle competence, even as a toddler watching everything with solemn eyes. The children changed how the ranch operated. Eliza insisted on bringing in a teacher for them and any other children of workers, setting up a small schoolroom in one of the outbuildings. Some of the men grumbled about the expense, but Caleb backed her completely. My children are going to know how to read and calculate and think, he told the crew. And so are yours if you want them to. Education isn't a luxury, it's an investment. The school became another way the Mercer Ranch distinguished itself. Families came to work there specifically because their children would get education. Workers stayed longer because they were building something for their kids, not just surviving season to season. Miller married Mary's niece, a sharp-tongued woman who took over the kitchen and modernized the meal systems. Tom trained a successor to manage the horses, knowing his own years of hard physical labor were limited. New workers became old hands, and those old hands trained newer workers, and the cycle continued. Garrett grew older, his body wearing down from decades of hard work. He moved slower, complained more about the cold, and gradually stepped back from the most demanding work. Caleb hired a younger foreman to handle day-to-day operations, but kept Garrett on as an advisor. It was a kind gesture that Garrett accepted with gruff gratitude. Never thought I'd live to see the day when I wasn't running this place, he admitted to Eliza one afternoon. They were both watching Hope and Samuel play near the barn, chasing chickens and laughing. You built the foundation for what this ranch is now, Eliza said. That matters. Does it? Because sometimes I think about how I fought you every step of the way, tried to keep things exactly as they'd always been. If I'd succeeded, this place would have failed. Maybe. Or maybe we needed the tension between old and new to find the right balance. Garrett snorted. That's generous. I was just being stubborn. You were protecting something you loved. I can understand that. Can you, even after how I treated you? Especially after. Because I know what it's like to fight for something you believe in, even when everyone tells you you're wrong. They sat in companionable silence, and Eliza realized that somewhere along the way, Garrett had stopped being an adversary and become something like a friend. It had happened so gradually she couldn't pinpoint when the shift occurred, but it was real. In their 12th year, disaster struck again. A summer drought killed half the grass, forcing them to sell off portions of the herd they couldn't feed. Then autumn brought early frost that destroyed what little grazing remained. By winter, they were struggling in ways they hadn't since those first brutal years. Eliza worked 18-hour days trying to find solutions. She renegotiated every contract, deferred every expense she could, and finally proposed something radical. "We sell the south pasture," she told Caleb. "That land we never use because it's too rocky for good grazing. There's a mining company that's been asking about mineral rights. We sell them the land and use that money to survive this season. That's my father's land. He bought it intending to expand the operation eventually. Your father's been dead 14 years. The land isn't doing us any good sitting empty while we struggle to feed our family. It feels like giving up, like admitting we can't make this work." Eliza took his hands, making him look at her. "It's not giving up, it's adapting. The ranch isn't the land itself, it's what we build with it. We keep the productive acreage, we survive this crisis, and we live to build more. And if my father would have hated that choice, then your father would have been wrong. You're not him, Caleb. You're building something different, and that's okay." They sold the land. The money carried them through the worst of the crisis, and by the following spring, they'd stabilized again. But something had shifted in Caleb, an acceptance that he didn't have to run the ranch exactly as his father had, that adaptation wasn't betrayal. "You freed me," he told Eliza one night, "from trying to be someone I'm not. You freed yourself. I just pointed out that the cage door was open." Hope turned 16 that year, tall and capable and frighteningly smart. She'd learned ranching from her father and business from her mother, and she had ideas about modernization that made even Eliza feel old-fashioned. Samuel, at 12, was quieter but no less competent, with an instinct for animals that reminded everyone of Tom. "They're going to be better than us," Caleb said, watching them work together to reorganize the barn storage. "That's the point," Eliza replied. "We build the foundation. They build higher." In their 18th year, Caleb got sick. It started as a persistent cough that wouldn't clear, then fatigue that rest didn't fix, then pain that he tried to hide but couldn't. By the time they got him to a doctor in the city, the diagnosis was grim. "Months, maybe a year if you're lucky," the doctor said. "Nothing we can do at this stage." Eliza felt the world tilt. They'd survived so much: poverty, natural disaster, social opposition, the endless grinding challenges of frontier life. But this was different. This was inevitable. Caleb took it better than she did. "We knew life out here was unpredictable. I just thought I'd go quick, kicked by a horse, or caught in a storm. This is slower, but it gives me time." "Time for what?" "To see the kids ready. To make sure the ranch is secure. To tell you everything I should have said years ago, but kept putting off." He spent his remaining months teaching Samuel everything he knew about land management and livestock. He helped Hope understand the bigger picture of ranch operations and regional business relationships. And he talked to Eliza, long conversations about the past, about choices they'd made, about what he hoped the future would hold after he was gone. "Don't let them turn this place into a monument to me," he said one evening. "I want it to keep evolving, keep getting better. Caleb, promise me. The ranch survives by adapting. You taught me that. Don't forget it after I'm gone." "I won't. And don't be alone too long. You're too young to spend the rest of your life as a widow." "I'm not discussing this." "Someone has to. Eliza, you made this ranch what it is. You deserve to keep living, not just managing." She couldn't promise that, so she held his hand instead and tried not to think about the empty years ahead. Caleb died on a clear spring morning, surrounded by his family and the ranch hands who'd become his extended family. He went peacefully, which felt like a mercy. They buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land he'd loved. The grief was enormous and disorienting. Eliza had lost her parents young, but this was different. This was losing her partner, her best friend, the person who'd seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. Some days she couldn't breathe through the weight of it, but the ranch didn't stop needing attention just because she was grieving. Cattle still needed tending, books still needed balancing, decisions still needed making. So she got up every morning and did what needed doing, because that was what you did out here. You survived. Hope took on more responsibility, working alongside her mother with a maturity beyond her 18 years. Samuel managed the day-to-day operations with help from the foreman. Together, the three of them kept the ranch functioning through those first awful months. And slowly, painfully, life continued. Eliza found herself thinking about legacy in new ways. Caleb had built something that outlived him. Not just the physical ranch, but the principles it operated on. Fair treatment, honest dealing, respect for workers and land alike. Those ideas had seemed radical when they'd started. Now they were just how the Mercer Ranch worked, accepted as normal by everyone who'd grown up with them. She thought about her own legacy, too. She was 46 years old, not ancient but no longer young. The children were nearly grown. The ranch was stable. What came next? The answer arrived unexpectedly in the form of a letter from a ranchers association asking her to speak at their annual meeting about financial management. Several other ranches had adopted systems similar to what she'd created, and people wanted to learn more. "You should do it," Hope said when Eliza showed her the invitation. "You've been telling me for years that information should be shared, not hoarded. Practice what you preach." People don't want to hear business advice from a woman. Maybe they did 20 years ago. Things are changing. You helped change them. So Eliza went to the meeting and gave her talk. Practical advice about bookkeeping, cost management, and treating workers as assets rather than expenses. She expected skepticism or hostility. Instead, she found an audience of ranchers desperate for exactly the kind of concrete guidance she could provide. More invitations followed. She started traveling to other ranches as a consultant, helping them organize their finances and implement better systems. Hope managed the Mercer Ranch in her absence, proving more than capable. Samuel handled the livestock operations with quiet competence. "You raised them well," Garrett told her. He was in his 70s now, mostly retired, but he still came around to offer advice and criticism in equal measure. "Both of them have their parents' best qualities, and some of their worst, I'm sure. Stubbornness is only a worse quality if you're wrong. They're usually right, so it works out." Eliza laughed, remembering how many times Garrett had accused her of that same stubbornness. "Coming from you, that's almost a compliment." "It is a compliment. You changed this place, Eliza, made it better than it had any right to be." "We all changed it. You, me, Caleb, everyone who stayed when they could have run." "Maybe, but you were the catalyst. Don't forget that." In her 53rd year, Hope married a man from a neighboring ranch, a partnership that united two operations and created new opportunities for cooperation. Samuel took over full management of the Mercer Ranch, implementing ideas that made Eliza feel both proud and ancient. The young man was improving systems she'd created, finding efficiencies she'd missed, building higher on the foundation she and Caleb had laid. Eliza stepped back gradually, letting the next generation lead while she focused on her consulting work. She'd become something unexpected, a frontier business expert, a woman whose opinion carried weight in rooms that had once excluded anyone without a beard and boots. She thought often about the terrified young woman who'd arrived at this ranch 28 years ago, broke and desperate and underestimated by everyone, including herself. That woman wouldn't have believed what she'd become, wouldn't have imagined the life she'd built. But then, that woman hadn't known what she was capable of yet. None of them had. Garrett died in his sleep at 74, peaceful and surrounded by family. He'd found late in life, when a widowed ranch cook had decided he needed someone to take care of him. Eliza spoke at his funeral, talking about how the ranch had been built by people who'd learned to respect each other despite their differences, who'd found ways to work together even when they disagreed. "He taught me that you don't have to like someone to value them," she said, "and that sometimes the people who challenge you the most are the ones who help you grow the most." Mary died 2 years later, still fierce and competent until the very end. Tom followed the next spring, going out to check horses one morning and simply not coming back, found later sitting peaceful under a tree like he'd decided to rest and never woke up. The old generation was passing, making way for new blood with new ideas. The ranch that had seemed so permanent and unchanging when Eliza first arrived was actually just a collection of people making choices. And as those people changed, the ranch evolved with them. Hope's children, Eliza's grandchildren, grew up in a world slightly softer than the one their parents had known. The territory had become a state. Towns had grown larger, railroads made transportation easier, medicine had improved, life was still hard, but the edges were less brutal. Eliza wondered sometimes what Caleb would think of it all, whether he'd approve of the changes or think they'd gone soft. But she thought she knew the answer. He'd wanted the ranch to survive and the people on it to thrive. However that happened was fine, as long as it happened honestly. On her 68th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and ranch hands young enough to be her great-grandchildren, Eliza looked around at the ranch she'd helped save and thought about legacy. Not the land itself, though that mattered. Not the cattle or horses or buildings, though those had value. The legacy was in how people treated each other, in the expectation that workers deserved respect and fair pay, in the understanding that good management meant transparency and honesty, in the idea that a ranch could be run with both profit and principles. These ideas had seemed radical once. Now they were just normal, to the people who'd grown up with them anyway. And those people were teaching them to their children, spreading them to other ranches, building something larger than any individual operation. "What are you thinking about?" Hope asked, sitting beside her. "How strange it is that we never really know what we're building while we're building it. We just make choices and hope they lead somewhere good." "Did yours?" Eliza looked at her daughter, confident, capable, running one of the most respected ranches in the territory. Looked at Samuel consulting with workers about next season's breeding plans. Looked at grandchildren playing the same games Hope and Samuel had played decades before. "Yes," she said, "I think they did." She lived another 6 years, long enough to see Hope's oldest daughter start learning the books the same way Hope had learned from Eliza. Long enough to see the Mercer Ranch celebrated not for its size or wealth, but for how it treated people and did business. Long enough to know that what she and Caleb had started would continue after she was gone. When she died at 74, peaceful in her sleep like Garrett before her, they buried her beside Caleb on that hill overlooking the ranch. The funeral drew ranchers from 3 states, all of them with stories about how Eliza Mercer had helped them, advised them, or inspired them to do better. Hope stood at the grave and thought about legacy, about a woman who'd arrived with nothing and built something that outlasted her, about choices made in desperate moments that rippled forward through generations, about love and partnership and the stubborn refusal to accept that things had to stay broken. "She changed everything," Hope said to Samuel, "just by refusing to back down." "She did," Samuel agreed. "Think we can live up to that?" "We don't have to live up to it. We just have to keep building on it." And they did. The ranch continued evolving, adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Hope's children took over eventually, bringing their own ideas and innovations. The specific practices changed with each generation, but the principles remained: fairness, honesty, respect, the understanding that people mattered more than profit, but you needed profit to help people. Some of those grandchildren and great-grandchildren eventually left ranching entirely, taking what they'd learned about ethical business and fair treatment into other industries, other places. The influence spread wider than Eliza could have imagined, touching lives she'd never know about, because that's how legacy actually works. Not as monuments or unchanged traditions, but as ideas that outlive their originators. As principles that get adapted and reimagined by each new generation. As proof that individual choices, made honestly in difficult moments, can ripple forward through time in ways impossible to predict. Eliza Ward had arrived at a frontier ranch expecting honest work and finding instead a choice: accept the world as it was, or fight to make it better. She'd chosen to fight, not through grand gestures or heroic moments, but through small, persistent decisions to do things right, even when it was harder. And decades later, long after she was gone, the ripples from those choices continued spreading. In ranches that treated workers fairly because they'd learned it worked. In women who pursued business roles because they'd seen it was possible. In communities that valued transparency and honesty because they'd witnessed the alternative. The ranch itself still stood on that land, though it looked different than it had in Eliza's day. Different buildings, different systems, different people. But walk through it and you'd feel something, a sense that this place operated on principles, that people mattered here, that doing things right was worth the extra effort. That was the real legacy. Not in stone or steel, but in how people thought and acted. In choices they made because someone generations back had made similar choices and proved they could work. Eliza and Caleb's story became family legend, the details embellished and simplified with each retelling. But the heart of it remained true. 2 people who'd found each other in difficult circumstances, built something worth protecting together, and refused to compromise their principles even when it would have been easier. And that was enough. More than enough. Because in the end, legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about creating ripples that continue long after the stone that caused them has sunk beneath the surface. It's about proving that a different way is possible and trusting others to build on that proof. The Mercer Ranch stood for another century, evolving with each generation, but maintaining a reputation for fairness and quality that traced back to those early, desperate years when a broke woman from St. Louis and a young rancher trying to fill his father's shoes had chosen honesty over convenience, partnership over hierarchy, and hope over resignation. Their graves on the hill were eventually joined by their children's, and their children's children, each generation adding to a legacy that was never about perfection, just about trying, persistently and honestly, to do better. And sometimes, on clear mornings when the light hit the mountains just right, you could almost feel them there. All those people who'd chosen this hard place and harder work, who'd built something that mattered not because it was easy, but because it was right. That was the story. Not of triumph or tragedy, but of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, of love that survived hardship, of principles that outlasted those who held them, of a legacy built not in what they accumulated, but in what they gave, to each other, to the people who worked beside them, to the generations who came after. It wasn't the story Eliza had imagined when she stepped off that wagon, terrified and hopeful and desperate for a second chance. But it was better than anything she could have planned, because the best legacies are never about following a script. They're about writing your own, one honest choice at a time, and trusting that the ripples will reach farther than you can see.